Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
Doris was annoyed with the session coming up, a lot of tales to turn in, no money to spare, not a penny, and this funeral. Her mother's neighbor, Aunt Wendy, had called and said that the funeral would be in a day. There would be round-trip tickets, and probably the cost of the arrangements, too, if Paul or Ashley didn't take care of it. I wonder if they know yet? But to write to her brother or sister was not allowed by pride. Doris decided not to go, not to spend money, not to see her relatives with their sneers and complaints. She was studying anyway, so she had nothing to do there. She would come later to sit on the grave. There was no regret or longing in Doris, rather irritation with notes of sadness, of the habitual way of life that had receded. Her relationship with her mother, her older brother and sister, had been difficult all her life. Her mother molded her into a diligent girl, forbade her to go out and do what she liked, forced her to learn lessons, help around the house, iron her school uniform in the evening. The forbidden fruit only beckoned more. She spanked her stubborn daughter for her first cigarette, took away her phone when she saw Doris kissing a boy at the gate. Her brother called her the naughty one from kindergarten. Her sister rolled her eyes and clucked her tongue. Eventually, at 16, Doris, in another fight with her mother over a beau, snapped and left home. She lived with a guy, finished school, then left with him 500 kilometers away in a big city. She worked for a long time, survived the separation, but saved up for education, and only at the age of 23, she finally entered a university when she realized the value and necessity of a diploma and education. The girl did not maintain relations with any of her relatives. She had enough friends and colleagues. Rumors, of course, came, what and how, but Doris was not looking for them purposefully. Why? So they'd tell her, "Hey, you naughty girl." No. Doris was now unwilling to sacrifice even a fraction of what she had worked hard and longed to achieve. She was studying working, and it was unrealistic to find time for a trip. And she didn't want to be honest. They'll sort it out without me. The girl decided and pushed closer the synopsis. Ashley's mother had failed to mold a decent girl. Unlike her straightforward younger sister, she had a cunning, dodgy character, went head over heels, and wasn't afraid to use methods that seemed dirty to others. So, without much connection or higher education, Ashley became running a small travel firm by the time she was 28 in the capital. She had a short haircut and generally looked very apathetic, with tattoos all over her arms, brightly colored makeup, and expressively pelted-faced beauticians. The news of her mother's death had caught Ashley in another country when she had just checked into a hotel with a girlfriend. The trip was a 10-day trip. As a calculating and practical lady, Ashley had figured out how much an unplanned return flight and a missing trip would cost, not to mention a ruined vacation. The solution was obvious: stay and rest. Ashley could have gone to her parents' funeral if she'd wanted to. She was in a good financial position, but principle intervened. Management is not for women. Her mother grumbled. Our business to create coziness at home and hearth to keep. Let the men earn money. It is their natural destiny, and we have a different appointment. What's our purpose, Mom? We are not cogs in the engine. People choose who to be. Ashley argued. It won't do any good to go against nature. Mother was relentless. You've already gone and painted pictures, and it's time to think about family. Ashley, in her favorite manner, rolled her eyes and snorted. Our song is good. Start over, it's called. Talking about family, husband and children had triggered her gag reflex since she was in transition. Her mother's old believers pissed her off more than anything else. To inculcate not humility, submission, and norms of domostroi ended up with the girl doing the opposite. Dress cut with scissors, changed into jeans and aggressive rocker outfits, instead of boiling soups, Ashley chose sketches of future tattoos. Instead of romances for the sake of bouquets and moonlighting, she sought out lucrative acquaintances. She knew she wanted to lead, to decide, and to get out of that box of traditional values her mother had stubbornly shoved her into. Of course, by the age of 28, the cherished dream came true. A chain of useful connections led her to the owner of a travel agency. Ashley promptly got a job there, then had an affair with a man and made it so that he formalized the business for her. Behind was a broken life of the ex-wife, a bunch of fired, unwanted female employees, and a pile of gossip. But the ambitious girl did not care. The winners are not judged, as they say. Ashley combined the leadership of the party and constant traveling. At home, even Cacti could not survive, not to mention husbands, children, and dogs. Self-sufficient, selfish Ashley loved unrequitedly only herself and did not want to spray on anyone else. So she quickly got rid of her suitor by taking away his business, very cleanly from a legal point of view. In this succession, Ashley visited her mother once a year, or even less often. She was sick and bored in her parents' house. There was no one to lead. Paul himself could have a group of men at attention when his visits overlapped with Ashley's, and Doris ran off with her boyfriend. That left arguments with his mother, where there was nothing new year after year. To make matters worse, Claire began to drink and complain about her health. Ashley wanted to get out of her father's house as soon as possible to avoid crossing paths and listening to the old woman's complaints. Her brother will sort it out for himself. He's a man, and he's the eldest, decided the apathetic head of the travel agency about the news. She should have been there a long time ago. God forgive her. She thought a little later, but didn't say it out loud so her girlfriend wouldn't hear. If Claire tried to make real women out of her daughters, she tried to raise a real man in her son. But again, everything turned out to be a mess. Paul, from a small age, was forced almost everywhere to solve his problems by himself, to stand up for himself and not to roar. If Ashley and Doris' mother nagged standard feminine admonitions, then from her son required steadfastness, firmness of character, stubbornness, and determination. In the end, it paid off. Paul really was a leader in the class, the head of the class and the first in studies, but in the shadow of achievements hid callous heart, despotism, narcissism, and indifference to other people's problems. He could make caustic jokes about ugly classmates who secretly counted on his interested look, could shout at his sisters and his mother herself. Doris all childhood hid from her brother in corners when he came home and in bad spirits, did not understand other people's tears because of a bad grade or worldly injustice. After school, the guy went into the army and decided to become a military man for good. For status and benefits, he married a shy girl from the backwoods, made a baby, and by the time he was 30, moved to the coast with his family. It remained only to guess what was going on at Paul's house, because his wife did not dare to say a word against him. Only a shadow in a dress looked out from behind her husband's back. The fool was clear that he walks from his wife and generally feels his full power and impunity. Paul came home mostly because of some paperwork issues. He knew that the mother began to be friends with the bottle, but limited himself to rare duty calls and sending money with the words, "Here, go to the doctor." Ashley considered a combative and almost fallen woman. Doris was an outright fool and a loser. He always held himself up as an example to them, without listening to any arguments. As a result, When all of them almost separated, communication was reduced first to dry hello in the walls of the house, then to a short text message on holidays, and later and completely hushed. And everyone was fine with that. The neighbor's call happened at breakfast. Paul, with a stone face, listened to the news. He pondered what to do. The death of a relative is a valid reason, and from the service, of course, you can leave. But first of all, it was far away, flying by airplane. Secondly, he had long ago had nothing warm ties, neither with his sisters, nor with his mother herself. Only actual blood relations. He hadn't been to his homeland in 2 years and hadn't bothered at all, and here was a funeral. Something akin to longing pricked Paul's heart, but quickly faded away. "Will you fly?" shyly asked his wife, serving coffee. "I'll send money for everything. They will organize themselves there." Repeated the man. "What about the inheritance?" Again asked his wife. Paul suddenly thought, "You're right, but we don't know if Mom left a will. And if not, then we will get the house for 3 by law. We don't have to break down either. These days, we can settle these things from a distance." Wendy stood by the fresh pit, holding the hand of a young girl. Besides them, there were about 10 other people at the funeral. Neighbors, friends, and former colleagues of the deceased. Paul, Doris, Ashley never arrived. Aunt Wendy blotted her eyes with a handkerchief and adjusted the black mourning bandage on her head. Oh, it's not Christian for the children not to say goodbye to their mother. We can't make them, can we? The girl sighed, clutching the carnations in her hands. "You're right, Lucy, you're right." Claire brought them up, put all her heart into it, and the children grew up so ungrateful. Wendy lamented, "Maybe at least they'll visit the grave, visit there." There were many kind words and tears about the modest wake, but more than one person asked Wendy and Lucy why none of the deceased's children were there, and they didn't know what to say. After all, they had personally called all of them. Lucy knew, but she was too reverent about Claire when she was alive and too respectful of her memory after her death to explain to everyone who lived there exactly what was going on. "And what are you crying for, pray tell?" Seriously, Claire looked at her son's red face. The boy rubbed his eyes with his fist and pointed to the sandbox, where another boy, Eric, a juvenile bully, was having fun with his blue brand-new toy truck. "He hit you and you're crying. You have to be a man." Claire reprimanded her son. "Otherwise it will always be like this. You'll always be a crybaby." Paul stopped talking, sobbed, and looked at the offender. "Don't hit first, but if you get hit, hit back," his mom taught him. "And don't give your own back unless you're asked first, and say please." Paul sat down on the bench and pouted, his 6-year-old brain digesting his mother's words. Claire watched the child, but was in no hurry to return her son's toy herself. After a couple minutes, Paul got up, walked over to the sandbox. "Give me back my car, please," he asked the offender. Instead of answering, the bully threw sand at Paul. The boy at the same moment jumped on Eric and firmly nailed him on the back of the head with a plastic spatula. Soon a siren sounded again from the sandbox, but from a different source. A wrinkled Paul in dirty shorts proudly carried the blue truck home. That day he realized something, that better than the word please, brute force works. At the time, his father was still living with them and was also doing his part in raising their first child. He forbade imposing female duties and household chores on his son. He said that a man should learn to earn and fight, wash pots, iron laundry. He would have a wife. As a result, the boy did not know how to make a bed, fry eggs at the age of 9, but quickly realized his superiority over girls and with this position entered adulthood. Father was in an accident and died when Paul was 13 years old, Ashley 8, and little Doris just turned 2 years old. Claire was not so much saddened as exhaled. Edward was a quiet tyrant and demanded total obedience from the entire family. Claire wanted her son to respect women and be strong in spirit, but his father's bad influence had already taken root in the boy's subconscious. The sound of broken dishes in the sink jerked Claire out of her sleep after her night's work as a cook, and she heard the noise and swearing from the kitchen. "Clean up after yourself," shouted Ashley, pointing her finger at the dirty plate on the table. "That's your job." Paul shrugged and indifferently threw the dishes on the floor. "Stop it." Claire shouted at both of them. "Ashley, is it hard for you to clean up and help your brother?" "Mom, I'm not the maid to clean up after everyone." The scandalized 10-year-old put her fists to her sides. "He has exams coming up. He's studying. He's tired. What are you, like a little girl?" Claire begged. "I've got a test tomorrow, so let Doris clean up after us." Ashley said. Claire shook her head. She silently picked up a plate from the floor, took a second one from the table, cleaned it all up and turned around. Paul had removed himself from the kitchen with a triumphant expression. Ashley was breathing noisily, her nostrils flaring wide. "Daughter, your smarter should be softer, more flexible." She put a hand on Claire's shoulder. "I don't want to." Ashley objected. "I don't want to be like you." She stamped her feet and ran to her room. Struggling to provide for her children after her husband's death, Claire worked very hard, taking more shifts, going years without a vacation, and still had her own business and garden at home. No personal life, no hobbies, no hobbies. Claire lived for her children and the desire to give them the best education, summer camp, clothes, goodies, toys. She would buy something for herself when a previous item wore to holes or ripped. One day a woman was getting ready to go to a parent-teacher conference for her 11th grade son. Paul looked around at the mother. Stompy shoes, a stretchy skirt with an old oil stain, a linty blouse, and a late 90s fashion jacket. The guy wrinkled his nose. "Don't go, I'll say you were working." He stopped the woman who was about to leave. "Why, son?" Claire, perplexed, matured at the offspring. "They'll think we're begging," Paul replied briefly. "Don't embarrass me, Mom." The woman froze on the doorstep. She had barely gotten off work to hear about her son's progress from the teachers' mouths. Claire turned to the narrow mirror on the exit and glanced at her own reflection. In front of her stood a tired, unpleasant-looking lady with bags under her eyes. "Go get some rest." Paul took his mother by the elbow. "I'm not a bigot. I won't be scolded for sure, but you already know that." Claire returned to the room, and tears came to her eyes, and then sleep washed over the exhausted woman. When Paul left for the army, Ashley was 14 years old. She had hoped her daughters would be her helpmate, but the exact opposite had happened. Ashley's transitional age began to manifest itself early, but very clearly. It was immediately clear that the paternal genes had left their imprint here as well. The girl was hysterical on any occasion, closed the door, crooked her face at any attempts of her mother to impute some morality to her. But among her girlfriends and friends, Ashley enjoyed authority and had undeniable power, and she could expel or teach a lesson to those who did not please her. "You can't do that, daughter." Claire sighed as she listened to Ashley's boastful tales. "You'll make enemies." "I can," the girl replied. "You can't." "I can. Are you going to torture your husband like this?" "He'll run away in a week." The woman shook her head. "Who says I'm ever going to have one?" Ashley folded her arms across her chest. What do you mean? Claire splayed her hands. What about a family? Sooner or later you'll want warmth, comfort, babies to babysit. Ah? Gross. Ashley grinned. I've seen enough of you, thank you. I'm fine. There are more interesting things in life than cleaning a man and feeding a baby. The conversation was over. Claire had asked herself many times why the children had grown up the opposite way, not the way she had raised them. Instead of love and understanding and respect, selfishness and ego gurgled in everyone. Paul stayed to serve under contract and enrolled as a correspondence student at a university to qualify for an officer's rank in the future. He hardly ever called, and when he picked up the phone, he waved off that he had no time to talk. Ashley, by the end of high school, was more concerned with her own appearance than with grades and exam preparation. She moonlighted in different places to do tattoos and fashionable haircuts. The first Claire for a long time did not know about, the second accepted with a stretch, calming herself that the hair is not teeth, will grow back. And she saw the pictures on her daughter's body when it was already late. A piece of work popped out from under the sleeve of her t-shirt. What? Ashley asked snidely, watching her mother stare at her arm in horror. Do you want to see the whole thing? The girl took off part of the t-shirt. A grinning dragon in mottled colors and bright spots stared back at Claire. Why? Why, you tell me? The woman frustratedly sat down on a stool. I wanted it so badly. Ashley shrugged her shoulders. I like it. It's not right. Claire muttered. It's a lifelong stigma for a girl. You'll be seen as you know who. A decent guy doesn't need a coloring book. Mom! Ashley bellowed. I've argued this 1,000,000 times, and I'll argue it 1,000,000 times for the first time. It's in your childhood. Tattoos were only for convicts and girls of easy virtue. It's in your youth you had to go to school, get married, and have a baby. In your worldview, girls wear dresses and boys wear pants. I'm so sick of your lectures. She threw the dirty rag that was wiping the table against the wall and ran off to her room. And in the evening, Ashley ostentatiously dumped her shredded skirts and dresses on the carpet in front of her mother. Now you can't make me wear this if you want to. She kicked the pile of rags angrily with her feet. I've seen these traditional feminine values in the furnace. Claire was no longer arguing. Her daughter was tormenting her with her behavior. She drank like a glass of water to dry. She only hastily wiped away a tear when she saw in a pile of rags the blue dress she had bought her daughter for the prom. Occasionally Claire was visited by her neighbor Wendy, a vivacious grandmother who also raised 2 children on her own, tilled a vegetable garden every season, and kept poultry. Ashley treated Wendy's Aunt Ashley leniently. She could treat her to jam, not interrogate, not teach. Doris often played with the neighbor's grandchildren and also took her well. Claire, you're looking a little gaunt. It's time you quit this kitchen. Stirring her tea with a spoon in her mug, Aunt Wendy said, How can you quit? Claire waved it off. What are the helpers for? There are 2 growing up. Wendy nodded at the framed pictures of the girls on the wall. Claire twirled the mug in her hands and gazed at the floating teas. Wendy, I don't think my kids like me. She exhaled. What am I doing wrong? Yes, stop it. Aunt Wendy waved her hands. All kids love their parents and yours do. You do so much for them. That's what I mean, nodded Claire. Wendy took a candy from the vase and rustled the wrapper. A child's individuality should be embraced, his view of the world encouraged, guided just a little supported, she mumbled. But how to accept if they break their future life? Claire thumped her fist on the table so that she spilled the tea. But it's their life, and you can't protect them from all the mistakes. Wendy calmed her down, helping to wipe up the puddle on the table. And the world changes and they change. You're teaching them to accept it, but what do you do? Claire suddenly froze. Her neighbor's words stabbed her in the soul, but it was impossible to admit it. The woman tried to be a caring mother with the attitude that she herself had seen in her childhood and that she thought was right. I have 2 boys. Wendy sat back down. So what do you think? They drank and smoked when they were young and went out and brought home D's. But now they are both handsome, both family men. They bring me grandchildren on weekends. Real men have grown up. The neighbor clapped her palm on the tablecloth. I scolded them, of course, in a good way, but the right to mistakes and bumps left. The woman continued, if you insulted your friends, you got a slap on the neck from them. If you tried vodka, let it be bad so that you get a kick out of it. That's how it is brought up. Only on their own skin they understand. I can't do that. Shook her head Claire, neighbor conciliatory, took her hand. Claire, even if you can't, the main thing is that you love them and want the best for them. They will grow up, then understand, and now let them sneer. Do not take to heart. Be above childish antics. They need to show themselves, to spread their peacock tails. Let them. Claire remembered her daughter's tattoo, her son's caprices and coldness, and could not understand how one could calmly react to such an attitude from close people. Although it was exactly that, insisted a kind-hearted neighbor. A paradox, no other way. Ashley went to the Capitol with some guy at 18, having drunk her mother's blood. She didn't want to study, but finished some courses in management and administration. Claire had talked to her daughter many times about the necessity of a normal education, but everything was as if she were talking to the wall. Ashley was of a different opinion and stubbornly continued to tear down the standardized female image. Doris was growing up too, and at first Claire had thought her a sweet and docile child. She wasn't soulless and narcissistic like her brother, nor was she selfish, dodgy like her sister, helping around the house, albeit grudgingly, cooking and cleaning. But from the age of 14, Doris' mind was exclusively on partying and boys. She often skipped school, ran on dates, hanging around with one suitor, then with another. Teachers called Claire with interrogations and requests to influence her daughter. To no avail. One day Doris long tolerated the moralizing mother and then gave out. I am young. I want to have fun, not over books mold sprouting. Claire gasped at this statement. If Paul and Ashley at least had goals and desires, even if not quite up to the gold standard, Doris was close to going down a crooked path. And so it happened. One day Claire found her daughter's pack of cigarettes in a hidden pocket of her jacket. Then she burst into her room and yanked Doris right out from under the covers, sleepy. Are you smoking? Shouted Claire at her. I don't need an ashtray at home. She grabbed the strap from her bag from the chair and slapped it on her defensive daughter's back. Claire had never had children, except for a little spanking when she was a kid, but here it was as if she had snapped, as if in that blow she had brought all her anger for the 3 of them down on one. Claire afterwards repeatedly blamed herself for the outburst, and the words "Sonny" came to her mind. Doris, the naughty skirt. Then Doris didn't talk to her for 4 days. She didn't stop smoking, but she hid it better, out of spite. And she stopped doing anything around the house, also out of spite. She had a boy who was a tomboy, an 11th grader and handsome, the kind of guy that drives girls under 20 crazy. Doris was no exception and went head over heels in love. Jack didn't do well in school, but he secretly drove her around in his dad's Ford at night. He taught her how to pour beer without foaming, and always told her about some murky business with the boys. Doris was impressed and dreamed of running away with her lover to the ends of the earth. That evening her mother caught them kissing under the cherry tree outside the house when she returned from work. Jack and his family, Claire knew perfectly well, sparse earnings wherever they could, a father who liked to lay by the collar, a mother who gossiped. Doris she pulled under her elbow, right out of her beau's embrace. "Mother, why do you always get on my nerves?" The daughter was furious. "You need to study, not with this tomboy cobble in the corners." Furious in response, Claire. "I'll take care of it myself. You haven't lived your life. Let others live theirs. You'll sort it out. You'll become a horse girl." Claire felt that her voice was breaking into a croak, and her face was burning with anger and helplessness. How could anyone accept such a thing? How could one accept knowingly ruining the life of one's own child? Claire didn't understand. Doris wanted to say something, but froze. The scandal ended when, the next evening, Claire did not find her daughter's things at home. She called her, wrote to her, asked her to come back, begged her to come to her senses, but Doris said briefly that she was now living on her own and did not need her mother, who considered her a wench. So the woman was left alone in the big house. And the other will say that live and be happy. The offspring got off her neck, but not Claire. No matter how the children treated her, it was harder to come to empty rooms. She called both Paul and Ashley, but they didn't like to talk for long, saying they were busy. They came rarely too, and not for long. Aunt Wendy came infrequently and somehow brightened the loneliness of her mother's abandonment. Claire even got a cat to keep her from being bored, but it could only listen and meow back. Soon the long hours on her feet and the age of 55 made themselves felt. On examination, the woman was told about a whole bunch of problems: varicose veins, cardiovascular disease, joints. Gradually, Claire herself did not notice how she began a friendship with the bottle to brighten the loneliness and drown out sad thoughts. Aunt Wendy entered Claire's house and found the mistress asleep in the kitchen at the table. The woman roused her. Lately, Wendy was very worried about the state of the neighbor. She became unsociable, constantly crying. Even the house began to fall into disrepair. Wendy tried to visit more often, but she couldn't stay away. She was in her 70s. "Claire, come up, it's morning." She shook the yawning and mumbling landlady, who jumped up, looking around and then shamefully hiding the wine bottle behind the table. "You've had enough of living alone," said Wendy, as Claire cleaned herself up and began to prepare breakfast. "Who needs me?" She waved me away. "Men look at young men, and I'm old." Wendy smiled, though she meant something else. "Men, it's a matter of time," said the neighbor. "And I think you need help and company." "My helpers are gone." Claire sighed, setting the cocoa down. "You're going off the beaten path again, aren't you?" Wendy scolded the woman. "I have an idea how to help you so you can have more fun without this happening." She kicked an empty bottle under the table. One of Wendy's sons often supplied orphanages with goods and other aid from concerned countrymen. Orphans on reaching adulthood were supposed to be given apartments under the state program, but in practice, some waited years for them, and some did not get them at all, and somewhere to live. "There's a girl named Lucy," Wendy told me. "Pretty girl, but she didn't get an apartment and had a baby at 19. Now she's scrounging around, can't live in a shelter, and you know how hard it is with kids to earn money for a rented place. It's a shame for the girl." "I still don't understand where you're going with this, neighbor." Claire listened attentively. "I'm saying that you should take her in and help her with the household, and she won't be bored, and you'll do a good deed. You won't work forever. You won't cook soup in this canteen, and I would have Lucy on old ties, in a kindergarten as a nanny. Wendy finished. Claire frowned. She didn't like the prospect of letting a stranger with a child in the house. But on the other hand, Wendy was right. She was already going crazy with loneliness. It wouldn't get any worse. "Do you vouch for her?" Claire asked her neighbor. "If I didn't, I wouldn't even be having this conversation." Aunt Wendy nodded. "I've known Lucy for a long time, and I even wanted to adopt her, but they didn't approve of it. So let her help you and live with you," said Claire. Wendy looked carefully into her eyes, looked warm and understanding. "Claire, I take her away from you, but you need her more. I can see that." Ashley looked irritably at the mud on her new shoes, the dirt of her hometown, the dirt she'd fallen into when she'd gotten out of the cab. Home, sweet home. She muttered through gritted teeth. Ashley didn't intend to stay here long, and the next day she had a plane to the capital, so she stayed in a hotel. She was mentally preparing herself to meet her relatives, her older brother and younger sister. After all, Hi, I can't say the same about you. Paul looked at his sister with a glare. He didn't like her haircut, or the tattoos already on both arms, or the lemon-colored stiletto shoes, or the red pants peeking through the semi-transparent blouse. Ashley appreciated the look and rolled her eyes, but quickly regained her neutral expression. They exchanged short phrases about life, the weather and nature, and waited for the last person to arrive. Surprisingly, there was almost no longing or sadness in the words of these people, only a poorly concealed irritation at having to break the usual way of life. No one even thought of going to the cemetery to say goodbye to the deceased. She's a maverick in her repertoire. Paul grinned, lighting another cigarette. She was told to come by 12 o'clock, so it's already the beginning of the first, and she's not here. She's probably wondering where she woke up today. Ashley chimed in. Probably mocking her little sister was the only thing she and Paul had in common. Soon a cab pulled up in front of the office, and a disheveled Doris jumped out, her hair in a ponytail, her crumpled t-shirt poking out of her jeans. "I guess you were right." Whispered in Ashley's ear, Paul glanced disdainfully at his relative. "You're late." Without greeting or ceremony, Ashley confronted her younger sister. "I know." Doris snapped back. "It's not my fault the bus took so long." Ashley rolled her eyes again and brushed her bangs aside. "You'll make it up to me later." Sarcastically, Paul said, already yanking open the doors. "We have more important things to do right now." The notary, looking like a business canary, sat everyone down in their chairs. "First of all, I express my condolences for your loss. The loss of your mother is a great blow. We can go without ceremony." Paul cut him short. "We're busy people. We don't have much time." The notary nodded ceremoniously and asked for the testator's death certificate. Paul pulled the document out of his briefcase and handed it to him. The man ran his eyes over the papers, checked something, made a short note, and finally pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. He showed his signature and the date on it. Mom must have sensed that the document had been drawn up 6 months before she went to the next world. Ashley whispered, not addressing anyone in particular. "Why did she have the nerve to write that will?" Paul replied irritably. "Maybe someone gave her the idea?" Doris suggested, and instantly caught the frown of her relatives. Both of them did not like the idea, for the consequences could be bleak. The second envelope, too, was made out, according to all the rules, with the signatures of the 2 witnesses and the notary himself. In one of the signatures and curlicues, Ashley recognized the hand of her neighbor, Aunt Wendy. The envelope was opened, and at last the paper lay on the notary's desk. The deceased's will was written on an ordinary yellowed sheet of paper from an old notebook, which didn't fit the official office and the situation. While the notary was reading the text, Ashley was nervously tapping her fingernails on the phone screen, Doris was crumpling a candy wrapper in her hands, and Paul was crunching his knuckles. Everyone understood the importance of the moment and waited. I bequeath all my movable and immovable property. The notary raised his eyes at the audience, made an expressive pause. Lucy Clark. Silence hung such that it seemed to hear a fly crawling on the smelt of one of the folders on the far shelf. I take it there is no Lucy Clark here. The notary looked equally surprised at the young people that Ashley jumped up first from her chair. Who the hell is Lucy? What the hell kind of mess is going on here anyway? She rushed over to the table, wanting to see for herself if what she'd heard was wrong or a joke, but her mother's handwriting communicated exactly what had been heard. None of the names of the 3 children Claire had put in the will, and not individually. A complex signature at the bottom, with plenty of curlicues, testified to what was written. Ashley remembered from high school trying to copy it in her diary and failing miserably every time. We're not going to let it go, threatened the notary Paul, who also wanted a bigger piece of the inheritance. We bet we'll sue this Clark, whoever she is. Yeah, sue all you want. The notary shrugged indifferently. My business is done, and don't forget the copies. Under the puzzled, lost, somewhere angry looks of those present, he made 3 copies of the will, certified them, and handed them to everyone in turn. I'll get that Clark from under the ground. Ashley rumbled on the doorstep of the office, not at all embarrassed by the passers-by. It is for her and the house and father's garage and the land where he wanted to build a cottage. Doris curled her fingers in horror. Yes, her mother gave it all to her. Paul spat in the flower bed. I wish I knew for what merits. We'll sue. We'll get every last board in the house. Ashley's eyebrows shot up angrily, her eyes blazing with rage. We will, but don't expect us to share too much. Paul slowed her down. What do you mean? Ashley glared at him. I have a son growing up, and he needs a place to live too. Paul emphasized the word son. And I need to invest in my business. You'll earn your own money for an apartment. Ashley bit him back. Hey, I don't actually have an apartment. I live in a rented one. Doris shouted, listening to her brother and sister squabble. They were both staring at her with eyes that made it clear they were ready to get rid of the 3rd inheritance claimant right there. Doris clutched her head cowardly into her shoulders. The bickering under the door of the notary's office continued. Everyone realized that a quick resolution of the case, delayed for an incomprehensible period of time, and entailed costs and nerves. Meet Lucy, and this is her son. Wendy introduced Claire to the girl standing modestly on the doorstep. She had a 1-year-old baby in her arms and a small plaid bag, poor clothes, but a thick braid on her shoulder and huge blue eyes that still had a certain childlike naivety, a belief in miracles. Claire remembered how children had looked at her with the same eyes a long, long time ago. Lucy, you come in. Make yourself comfortable. Claire will show you around. Wendy pushed the undecided girl into the room. When the guest left, the neighbor asked, Claire, what are you doing out of touch? Good girl, have I ever deceived you? Good, Wendy, good. Claire dismissed it. But I'm not used to it, you know? You gotta look at her. Claire looked at her for a couple of weeks. At first, the conversations between the new acquaintances were awkward and clumsy. Wendy, as promised, got the girl a job in a kindergarten where she was happy to work. This way she could look after her baby and earn a little money. In the house, Lucy did not manage much, only asked short questions about cleaning and other household trifles. The baby didn't interfere with anything either, and was quite quiet. The awkwardness was gone thanks to his majesty of occasion. "Claire, I'm back," Lucy said loudly as she opened the door. The landlady's shoes were in their place, but she herself could not be heard. She cautiously entered the room, placed the cradle with her son on the armchair, and found Claire napping. There were a couple of empty wine bottles on the floor next to the sofa. Lucy rushed over to the woman and began to bring her to her senses. Claire opened her eyes and looked around awkwardly. She'd promised herself every day for the last 6 months that she wouldn't buy any more wine, that she wouldn't lock herself in her room and drink until the aching feeling of emptiness was filled. But when she'd come back from her shift, her feet had carried her to the store and her gut had demanded relaxation. Claire guessed that Wendy had insisted that Lucy move in because she knew about her neighbor's addiction and was worried. Also, everyone realized that Claire's children didn't care about her. They are busy with their lives, and at most they will put their mother in rehab for a long time. "Claire, what are you doing?" Lucy looked anxiously into the woman's eyes. "Your blood pressure, your heart isn't right, and you're drinking?" Claire was dumbfounded. The girl shamed her, but justifiably so. And then the unexpected happened. The accumulated tension, longing, sadness overflowed the cup and tears spilled out. Claire buried herself in Lucy's chest and burst into tears. The girl fell into a stupor for a couple of seconds, and then embraced the woman and began to caress her back and comfort her as if she were a small child. I always dreamed of having a big family, said the lady of the house, while Lucy was pouring tea. I wanted to be a mom, played mother's daughter all my childhood, read fairy tales about princesses. John sat in the stroller, staring at Lucy and Claire. He listened too, occasionally yelling and banging his fist on the side of the stroller. "Mama wouldn't let her go out with the boys. She taught me to be meek, malleable, soft. She said that you should take care of yourself for your husband, and I looked at them with my father and thought that I would have the same, a warm family atmosphere, respect, hot dinner in the evenings at a big table. We had a small table, though, and the apartment was only 2 rooms. Claire sniffed her nose like a schoolgirl. Lucy put the cups on the table and sat down on a stool nearby, watching her son, who was beginning to fall asleep. I always thought the husband was the pillar, the wall, the main but wise one. That's how I lived until I met Edward. I fell madly in love, but I didn't see who." Claire continued. "I got pregnant with Paul, we got married, and then Edward moved us here to this house, and I realized I was in a fairy tale." The woman grinned and sipped from her mug. "Not the fairy tale I'd read, though. I thought I was a princess, but it turned out to be Cinderella. You would know how much I crawled here on my knees pregnant, scrubbing the floors, washing all the windows and mirrors every day. I cooked 3 meals with a belly button, first, second, and compote." Lucy listened without interrupting. "Husband worked, received well. We had enough, but demanded perfect cleanliness and housekeeping, and I was happy to work like a horse on home bread. Loved strongly, caught rare moments of tenderness from him after reproaches for dirty table or unpalatable cutlets. I thought it was my own fault. I didn't work hard enough, I didn't see it through. Then my son was born, and I went into motherhood, began to raise myself a joy. Only bad things stick easier and faster, we all know. And instead of a good son, grew a copy of her husband, who thought that a woman only should. Oh, his poor wife now, poor girl. How am I to blame for her?" Claire sniffed her nose again and hastily pulled out her napkin. "You had nothing to do with it," Lucy intervened gently. "You did everything you could to make the child happy. Bad example and bad upbringing played a part. I would like to raise my son to be a noble, kind, and just man, like his grandfather. explained Claire with a sigh. What a shame he spent so little time with his grandson and left early. If only it had been different. If only it had been. My love and care and involvement was taken for granted by my husband and later by my son. This I realized many, many years later, and then I did not see my mistakes and made the same with my daughters. John dozed ludicrously in the stroller, arms outstretched. Claire stood up to cover the baby with a blanket. Lucy did not disturb her. When I got pregnant with Ashley, my husband demanded that I contribute to the family budget. I ran headlong to work wherever I could. We were a family. Although morally he ate me up every single day, and then I found out he was cheating. Cried to my mother looking for support. She said that everyone has so. Bear with it. The main thing, children. He'll take a walk and come back. That's how I learned that my own father was not such a noble man. Just my mother was wise and did everything to make me see the perfect picture. It was getting dark outside the window, and a fine October rain began to drip on the windows. The neighbor 2 houses away had a rooster crowing loudly for some reason. Lucy pulled the curtains and carefully carried the sleeping John into the room to put him to bed, promising she would be back soon. When the new neighbor tiptoed carefully into the kitchen, Claire was already making tea for the second time. And I did a new stupid thing, the landlady continued. I forgave him, just as my mother said, and that young knave, 26 years old was only. Husband realized that he has over me full power and can in any situation to remain unpunished. He tore through for every speck, for crumpled laundry, for the mess of children, and I obediently tolerated and only scolded myself that bad hostess, bad mother, bad as a woman, and then the 3rd pregnancy. I decided to leave, hoping for miracles once again, but no. In the upbringing of the girls, my husband was stricter, scolded for any disobedience, even the very tiny Doris, and for some reason I gave in. I clogged their heads with marriage, correctness, wise womanhood. Oh, if only I'd realized sooner, if only I'd realized. Claire raised her eyes to the ceiling and blinked often, stopping the tears from welling up on her lashes. And when my husband crashed with his mistress, as I found out later, it was as if the rope around my neck had loosened. I myself was surprised that I should be sad and cry, but no, though I had to work harder. I was glad, but so far only that no one else would come to my bed from under someone else's skirt. Quiet humiliation left and my eyes began to clear, but I still lived, indoctrinated by my mother. A woman needs a family, a loving husband his corner. I tried to instill this in my daughters, and now both of them see me as an enemy, and my son, in general, as a second-class man. Lucy moved closer, hugging Claire lightly, her shoulders shaking. I wanted so much to bring up sweet, affectionate girls, but I grew up with my lashings, selfish and Walker. Do you know, Lucy, what is the saddest part of this story? She looked up at the girl. That I realized my mistakes only when they are all gone, and I am aging, lonely, and not needed by any of them. Claire, don't be so nervous. Lucy's calm strokes on my back were soothing. All people make mistakes, but there are no mistakes that can't be corrected. You did what you knew how to do. You loved and cared for them as best you could, and knew how. I'm sure it's worth talking to everyone, and everything can still be saved. Oh, my dear, you think I didn't try when consciousness overtook me. Claire sighed. I called, wrote, invited them to visit. They waved me off, said they were busy. The only thing I got was a couple of meetings with my grandson and money for medicine and doctors. I decided to go to them myself, but they stopped me. I endured, tried to understand, to justify them, but I knew I was fooling myself. I was burned by this feeling of helplessness in front of those I had created. So I broke down, yes, I started drinking. It's the only way I can take away for a little while the pain of not being needed by my children. All your life you have given yourself and your joy to people around you, your husband, children, strangers, but have you ever been truly happy? Lucy asked cautiously. I don't remember. The woman was silent for a long time before answering. I was happy for my son's grades, for my husband's success, for the children eating well and not getting sick. That's not it, Lucy said. Although, as a mom, I understand you. I too rejoice when John eats and sleeps. It's good, but it's different. When you are happy for yourself internally, genuinely happy. This time Claire was silent for a long time, trying to search for such a long-forgotten feeling in her memory, and found it only in childhood, when her mother brought her a small kitten from work. Claire had played with it for a long time then, cherished and stroked the animal. I think I have long forgotten what it is. She answered quietly. Many people forget, but it is very important to keep the ability to be happy at any age. Lucy smiled. Let's learn it again, shall we? Let's. The woman smiled weakly in response too. Thank you. Surely the neighbor must know who this Lucy is. Ashley reasoned as she sat in the cab, once again cursing at the lack of asphalt and the dirtiness of her hometown. When the fervor for cursing at the notary's office wore off, the trio decided to go to Aunt Wendy's house. She had called with the sad news she also often visited her mother, and her signature was on the envelope with the will. But it was too late. Aunt Wendy had slammed the wicket door shut with an unprecedented swiftness for an old woman. There was a squeal from Doris, whose fingers were nailed, and immediately afterward, Paul's cursing. The company realized that no one else would talk to them here. Their mother's swinish attitude had played its part. Ashley and Paul took some documents and things from their once empty home, and then all three of them left for their respective cities without getting anything. Here you go. Lucy, smiling radiantly, handed Claire a cotton candy stick. For me. The woman was so confused that she stared at the treat, wary or uncomprehending. It was hot, a Saturday, and both of them had the day off. A small circus that had arrived was performing in the local park. Lucy, on the pretext of going for a walk with John, dragged Claire out to walk there. Let's go, let's go. She jokingly hurried the crumpled Claire, already on the doorstep. On the last warm days of October, it was simply a crime to stay home. The woman hesitated at first, then agreed. Claire caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since she had taken a walk like this. All her routes were calibrated for a specific purpose: work, home, store, hospital. She'd somehow forgotten that you could just wander aimlessly like that, for the pleasure of chatting with someone and not constantly looking at your watch. The park had already begun to put on its fall finery. The purple maples sprinkled on the sidewalk a carpet of patterned tree leaves. The soft branches were swaying, where the leaves were golden like a scattering of coins. Late blossoms bloomed in the beds. The sun glistened on their petals like a bead of night rain, and only the Christmas tree stood unperturbed and green among October's orange-red palette. Claire even admired the scenery, sighing at the still warm, but already drenched in fall dampness, air. She remembered long-forgotten feelings of calm, joy, silent, quiet delight, when vanity seemed to be wiped away like dirt from glass. Did you enjoy the performance? Lucy asked. Yes, I haven't been to a circus in probably 20 years, Claire admitted. I never thought you could go there just for fun, without an occasion or your kids. A lot of things are really fun to do for no reason. Supported her Lucy, fixing John's beanie. Who said you needed an occasion to be happy anyway? Claire looked at her, either with respect or with sudden insight. You know, Lucy, you're not at all what I used to think you were, she confessed. The girl laughed. Who did you expect? A wimp with a depressive temper. Well, not exactly. Claire mewed awkwardly. The question confused her. Lucy wiped John's applesauce-smeared hands. They wanted to leave him there. But I didn't let them. I couldn't wait for an apartment, so I rented a room in a communal house on my cleaning lady's salary and child allowance. That's how I fully realized how important it is to be happy, that you just live and perhaps help others to live. And that's why you went to work with children. Claire suddenly guessed. Yes, Lucy nodded. Children still know how to enjoy the little things, while adults are drowning in routine. In some stereotypes, in fictitious frameworks we cage ourselves in, where there is nothing but vanity, problems, and fears. There are very few people who in adulthood can genuinely rejoice and see the beauty around them. She pushed back her braid and pointed with her hand to a woodpecker on the trunk of one of the maples. Claire also noticed the bird with the red barret, which was busily hopping along the bark. You have welcomed me into your home, you have been kind, and I am eager to help you enjoy life again. Lucy said, and you're starting to get good at it. Claire hugged the girl, hiding her wet eyes from her. It had been a month since that conversation in the kitchen that evening. Claire had forgotten the last time she'd had a drink, and her house felt cozy and light again, in a way it probably never had before. Maybe it was because both women needed that coziness, and both tried to keep it. Evenings were spent in conversation over fragrant tea or in walks. Lucy told Claire about everything, and the woman was amazed at how broad the girl's horizons were and how much she herself had missed in life. One day the company wandered into the evening park again, and some guy gave both of them a rose. Claire was so embarrassed she didn't know where to put the flower. She finally wanted to come home in the evenings, cook something delicious, hang out with John, listen to Lucy. It was amazing how dear this stranger by blood had become to her. Aunt Wendy sometimes came to visit and watched more and more as Claire survived, as the blush returned to her cheeks and the sense of purpose in her eyes. It was as if Claire had gained a daughter and a grandchild during this time, and no talk of rightness or marriage. How easy it was to accept a man with his special views, his cockroaches, and his experience, and even if Lucy cooked soup differently, cut bread thickly, and scrubbed floors the old-fashioned way, Claire no longer wanted to argue, to correct, to teach, and it was not indifferent resignation, but the very acceptance that she had always imposed on her daughters imposed what she herself did not understand. One day at lunchtime, two men knocked at the wicket of Claire's house, and the landlady came out, looking behind the wicket in surprise. Lucy was at that moment putting John down for his afternoon nap. "Hello, we're from the utility company. We're checking the wiring for connections past the meters." The men introduced themselves and shoved some form under Claire's nose, which she didn't have time to look at. "Everything is legal." She stretched out confused. "If it's legal, we'll check for frayed wires. What if you have a leaky roof?" The danger of a fire due to a short circuit is no joke. One of the guests raised a finger, very determinedly put his foot in the yard. "All right," the woman stepped aside, allowing the workers to pass. The repairmen began to inspect the wires and their location, and then with serious faces looked at the pole, scratched the back of their heads, wrinkled, and as a result they said, "You have one wire here that is not connected to the meter, and the coating on it is frayed. We need to cut it off and look in the house to see if there are any signs of a short circuit, but I don't think I shorted anything. The TV works. The bulbs are intact. Claire shrugged. Tell the firemen the same thing later. One of the men yanked her indifferently. The woman had no choice but to let the workers into the house, and they were very active, climbing along the outlets, picking at the lamps, looking into the panel, studying how the wires were laid. They didn't even take off their dirty shoes. Claire just sighed, propping her cheek with the palm of her hand in the hallway. 10 minutes later, one of the workers came to her again and with a sorrowful face said, "Mistress, there was a leak in the ceiling next to the switchboard and sockets without grounding. You need to repair or share a kranets 220 from the kettle or iron in the rain and all." He even made scary eyes for convincing. So how is it? How many years have I lived and everything is quiet? Claire just splashed her hands. You live for so many years and tomorrow it will happen. Her interlocutor continued to frighten her. Suddenly his partner came out of the corridor, and Lucy came out with a telephone in one hand and a heavy glass carafe in the other. "We don't need to change anything," she said sternly, shaking the decanter. "We didn't call anyone. What are you doing, girl? We came to fix the problem." The fifth man, a man in blue overalls, waved his hands. "Troubleshooting that you just made up yourself. Get out, or I'm calling the police." Lucy showed the dialed number on the phone screen. The men squared their heads and looked at each other apprehensively. Claire was dumbfounded, but her hand instinctively found the heavy ladle on the table with which she had recently poured in the soup for lunch. "Claire, these so-called electricians came in with no tools, no paperwork, and a piece of paper from the internet. Call and have them picked up." After these words, the men rushed out of the house, so much so that they almost took out the door. Claire only had time to hear from the yard through the window. "Didn't you say this woman lives alone?" Dear, when her pounding heart calmed down and her breathing became steady again, Claire was already sitting at the table, waiting for Lucy to put some valerian in her glass. "How did you realize that these crooks are not from the communal center?" she asked the girl. "I saw from the window and heard how you let them in, and immediately noticed that they came without tools. Electricians don't just walk around like that. And they won't come at all if you don't call them." Lucy watched the drops on the neck of the vial carefully, and then one of them dropped the paper they were shoving in your face, and then everything became clear. She set the glass down in front of Claire, pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket. It was a crookedly scanned installation permit from a year ago. "Oh," sighed the woman, "what would I do without you?" Obviously would have been left with no savings. Lucy answered bluntly, "But everything turned out well. But let's change the locks on the gate and the door, just in case." The women became almost kin to each other. Lucy made friends from the young staff of the kindergarten. She sometimes asked Claire to babysit her son while she herself took time out to go to the hairdresser's or to buy some little things. It was a joy for Claire to babysit John. She even thought of him as a grandchild. How different were these happy moments from the few miserable hours she was allowed to spend with her blood grandson. Paul and his wife were constantly criticizing her for everything and literally ripping the baby out of her hands. Things were different with John. He happily collected with Claire-colored pyramids of rings, threw cubes and balls, learned to walk, supported by a caring woman. Lucy would sometimes come and watch from around the corner, watching Claire's reverence for her son. Everyone understood it all, and everyone needed it. One evening, the girl came into the kitchen to take the baby from the mistress of the house and noticed a slight sadness on her face. "What's wrong, Claire?" Concerned, Lucy asked. "Oh, Lucy, my heart aches for my own children." Claire sighed. "I wish we could communicate with them like we do with you." About everything in the world, at least on the phone, but for 6 months they almost do not call and do not write. Doris ignores me completely. Lucy's having second thoughts. I think you can try to establish a relationship with your children, but you need patience. I've put up with an autocratic husband all my life, and I'm sure I have enough patience. Claire gave the girl a serious look. To pick up the phone and write to the children. These thoughts made the woman stupor and fear of a new refusal to contact her loved ones. So strange, she both wanted and feared it. The fear was vividly resurrected, memories of her youth of caprices and torment with the hard characters of her offspring. And then Claire pushed the heavy thoughts out with an effort and began to remember the fall walk in the park and after the circus show. She imagined walking like that with Ashley or Doris. Finally, having tuned in enough, Claire dialed her eldest daughter's cell phone. "Hello." Ashley's voice came through after a series of long beeps. "Hello, Ashley." Claire exhaled, gathering her strength. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine." "Why are you calling?" Her daughter's voice became suspicious. "Do you want money for the doctor or something?" "No, my daughter. I just want to talk to you." The woman took a sip. "Well, you talk. I'm listening." They agreed on the other end of the line. Something rustled in the phone. A knowledgeable person would have immediately realized that the call had been put on speakerphone. "Ashley, you and I have never picked each other up. Claire started it. It's probably my fault. I imposed something I was unhappy with without realizing it. Forgive me, please. But now I realize my mistake, and I want to know how you live. What you breathe. I want us to be able to talk like girlfriends, not hold grudges. Are you okay with that?" Some clicks, distant mumbling, rustling were heard in the phone. "What are you talking about? Are you talking to your girlfriends?" Ashley's voice came from far away. Was Aunt Wendy here? Then it became clear that the girl was dealing with some work issues on another phone. "Yes, chatting." Claire's lips quivered. "Bye, daughter." She pressed the cancel button and cried, covering her face. Lucy rushed to comfort the poor woman, but she sobbed like a wounded animal. "Oh, I'm an old fool to have hoped for a miracle." Claire scolded herself through her sobs. "Who needs me with my old morals?" "I do. Let's try again, shall we?" Claire looked at her dejectedly, smearing her tears. A little later, Lucy corrected herself, nodding cautiously. Frustration and sadness left Claire alone only towards evening. She realized that one attempt wasn't enough, that more would be needed, and already the first one had stabbed at her soul. It was even scary to call Paul. He was the most callous and cold-blooded of the three. The woman didn't even know what words to choose for such an important conversation with her son. Only Lucy's closeness, her support, sincerity, and participation gave Claire strength and determination. Paul picked up the phone immediately. Unlike Ashley, his clear, chiseled service "hello" rolled through the house, even from the tiny speaker. "Hello, son," Claire began. "I wanted to." "Mom, hurry up." Paul interrupted her irritably. "I've got things to do." "What's wrong?" Nothing. The woman lowered her eyes sadly. "I won't bother you then." "Yeah, go ahead. It came from the other end. We'll try again later. We can't give up." Lucy comfortingly took Claire's palm in her hands. The woman was no longer crying after the second call. Her eyes were filled with detachment. "Lucy, I don't think it's any use. They're adults, and they've been used to ignoring me for so long that it's too late to re-educate them. And your youngest, Doris? She's a little older than me," Lucy thought. "I don't know her contacts," Claire said, somehow embarrassed. "She blocked me everywhere after the fight. All I know is that she lives in the city and is studying, I think. Well, at least there should have been some channel of communication. Lucy wouldn't let it go. Suddenly Claire jumped up and, muttering something, hurried into the room. She rummaged through the dresser for a long time, then pulled out a dusty diary. Among the recipe notes on proper cotton washing and phone numbers, the woman found her daughter's email addresses. She had once used that address in high school back in the day. Claire pointed to the corner of the page, and as I hadn't remembered before, that's better than nothing. Approved Lucy. We'll think about what to write tonight, but in the meantime, how about some ice cream? Ice cream in December? Claire smiled. Why not? Lucy winked at her. Who said you can't? The mood would be instantly better. Just what the doctor ordered on such a gloomy day. Claire watched with her cheek pressed against her cheek, realizing that Lucy was trying her best to keep her spirits up, but her mother's heart would still ache. Even though she had become like her own daughter, she couldn't undo the mistakes of the past on her own. It's amazing how sometimes common troubles pull together and try on even sworn enemies. After returning to their respective towns, Ashley, Doris, and Paul started a general chat room where they discussed contesting the will. It took a couple weeks to figure out Lucy's identity and get the outside story. Albeit with a creak, the company agreed to split the inheritance exactly 3 ways. Nevertheless, Ashley pestered the lawyer with questions about how to legally get the most of it. The poor guy already regretted that he had tangled with her and mentally cursed all the gods who had once invented the court and inheritance. That Lucy, the orphan with the litter. Ashley's voicemail message. Allegedly nursed her mother for the last year, but there's no paperwork to prove it, which means nothing to her or her offspring. That's interesting. Paul replied. Some left wench with a child, lived on everything ready for a year. Her mother wrote off everything for it. What a ride of unprecedented generosity. Can I also live like that and hop, in a year, another year with an apartment? Doris finished. Ashley clicked her pen irritably, pissed off by the situation. Peace, calmness, measuredness of stable income, partying and recreation shook because of this idiotic will. Now by the efforts of her mother, it is necessary to make a fuss, spend money and time. Yes, relatives know how to put a pig under the door. She stretched under her nose. Even after death. The prospect of sharing did not please either. Communication with brother and sister generally irritated. Paul covered himself with a child, Doris with the lack of a place to live. The first was going ahead, the second was whining like a mosquito itching for breath. Ashley caught herself thinking that she wouldn't mind doing her brother and sister a favor if they were busy solving their immediate problems, here and now, instead of gnawing away at their inheritance. Lucy and John had gone to daycare, and Claire had just returned from her night cook shift. For weeks now, the woman had been plagued by a vague premonition. She had been thinking long and hard, deciding to calculate something in her mind, weighing it, but Lucy hadn't mentioned anything. The woman took a nap for a few hours, thought it over once more, and went to her neighbor's house. Wendy, I want to write a will, she blurted out, sitting down in front of her. God be with you, Claire. Aunt Wendy waved her hands. Are you going to die? I have a hunch. Claire frowned. I don't know. I feel like I should do it now. When Aunt Wendy stopped oohing and aahing over her neighbor's statement, she clarified. It took me a long time to get ready, but I think I'm doing the right thing. Well, it means that you have to call a notary if you're going to do it. Wendy thought. It's impossible to do the procedure without one, Claire confirmed. The women called the notary's office and made an appointment. The notary said that 2 witnesses would be needed. "Don't tell Lucy, please." Before leaving, Claire asked her neighbor. "So I thought Lucy would be the second." She shook her hands. Claire shook her head. "No, we can't have her." Wendy thought for a moment. "I've got a son coming over in those days. Maybe him?" Claire nodded, said goodbye to her neighbor, and went home with a slightly relieved heart. The day before, she had spent a long time composing something else. She had written a lot of pages in an email for her youngest daughter. She scribbled again, then struggled to create an email account for herself with the help of Lucy and slowly retyped the text onto the screen. It had been a week since she'd sent it, but the inbox was just as sad and empty. Lucy had said that sooner or later her daughter would reply, something, a single word. Claire tried to believe. She generally tried to notice more good things around her. It became an acute daily necessity, on the way to rid herself of the colossal guilt and resentment she felt toward herself, her children, and life, and sometimes Claire felt she was succeeding. In the flight of a swift, in the glint of a puddle in the sun, in the warmth of a mug of fragrant tea passed from hand to hand, she gathered the grains of her medicine, and there was someone nearby who always supported and protected the fragile, recovering soul. Ashley drew on all her connections and hired the best lawyer available to challenge her mother's will as quickly as possible. It took several months, but the girl got her way. The judge confirmed that as direct heirs of the first turn, the native children of the deceased, the three of them, Ashley, Paul, and Doris, have legal rights to receive all the property of the mother. However, the second part of the plan could not be realized. The inheritance was awarded equally to each. Nothing. Ashley rubbed her hands together as she walked out of court. "We'll use our own methods here." The main thing is that the sneaky orphan was left with nothing. That's what the bossy travel agency boss used to do when legal methods were exhausted. A couple of conversations, hit the right pain points, scare her, gather dirt. What difference does it make how she gets what she wants? Paul and Doris did not attend the trial. The former cited service, the latter the cost of travel. Ashley alone represented the three, though the interest was more likely to be all hers. The relatives were notified of the entry into the inheritance by registered letters from the lawyer. The girl pondered the course of action. How easier to force the fools, brother and sister, to sell the mother's property as soon as possible so as to hide from them a part of the income from the transaction. Ashley's plans were Napoleonic. She had long yearned to open a second branch of the agency, to exchange her one-room apartment for a two-room apartment closer to the center, and what to say to go to another country. The unfair division of money, not the welfare of relatives. Ashley did not care. What was to say about a strange girl with a strange child? Neither Lucy nor Aunt Wendy were present at the trial. The older woman and the young mother had no way of traveling to the capital, even though they knew what was going on. Lucy was taken aback when she learned that Claire had left her all her possessions. The girl was very confused. She had experienced 2 shocks in 1 month. First from Claire's death, then from her will. The woman had passed away in her sleep. She had suffered a heart attack. Lucy found her on her bed when she returned from work. It was 2 months after the will had been written. Claire had a feeling, and she wasn't wrong, unfortunately. So where is that abstract? Doris muttered irritably to herself, picking at the balls of her laptop. She had been given a study assignment the day before, and she remembered that she had prepared a big report on a similar topic at school. Doris decided to find it, print it out, and turn it in again, so that she wouldn't have to spend time collecting and processing the material again. Ashley had contested the will, and now the 3 of them owned the house, the land, and the garage. Doris was tempted to look for a cozy apartment in the suburbs. She was already dreaming of moving there. What kind of repairs she would make, what kind of sofa she would buy. All the farthest school folders on her laptop had been dug through, and the system search had failed to find anything. Doris was already nervous, imagining a sleepless night of preparing the essay, but her memory obligingly told her that she had sent the work to the teacher's mailbox in the 10th grade. She had to remember the password to the mailbox she hadn't used for a long time. She managed to log into the account after a long manipulation and began to scroll through her inbox with interest. Mostly there were advertising offers, letters from some depressing scammers, archival photos with classmates. Stop! What is this? Suddenly a letter from an unfamiliar address caught Doris' eye. It was strikingly different from everything else that had accumulated in her email box for so many years, and the letter was not so old. It had been sent a little less than 8 months ago. My eyes ran along the lines indifferently at first, but with each word I read, interest, anxiety, embarrassment, realization, and shame grew like a snowball. Hello, my daughter. How are you? I don't know if you will read my letter or not, but I hope you will. I want to apologize for everything from beginning to end, for the upbringing you disagreed with, for my desire to mold you into a copy of myself and condemn you to the same torment, for not paying attention to your inner world, and for the chasm that separated us that evening at the courtyard, turning into years of silence and coldness. I hope you'll forgive me. I realized my mistakes only many years later, but I don't blame any of you three. You grew up to be what you grew up to be, and I'm still secretly proud of all of you, but we made so many mistakes. Resentments, misunderstandings, harshness, and rudeness have divided us all as if we were strangers. How many of your happy moments I missed and did not see, for which now I blame myself terribly. I would never have dared to write to you, my daughter, if I hadn't had help. I met a girl who opened my eyes and showed me what I had been depriving myself of all the years of your childhood. I finally have the strength to admit it. I realize I'm asking the impossible, but let's try to be just a little closer, like siblings? I hope with all my heart for a speedy answer. Your mother, Claire. Doris finished reading the letter, her lips jumping, her shoulders shaking. She leaned back in her chair and burst into tears. Those pure, sincere words of her mother burned all the years of resentment out of Doris's soul. That night she didn't sleep. She forgot about the essay, about her studies, about the fact that she had to go to the next day's classes. Doris sat on the floor of the room against the wall until morning, hugging a small plush toy that she had brought from home many years ago, given by her mother on September 1. The toy had been gathering dust under the couch in a bag for years, but today Doris had found it, blown the trash away, cleaned it, and coddled it like a kitten. At dawn, the plush was wet with tears, her eyes swollen, her face flushed. As soon as the clock struck 8, Doris realized it was time, or rather, it was already possible. She frantically flipped through the phone book, looking for Aunt Wendy's number. Finding it, the girl called the older woman, apologized repeatedly and with difficulty, but got Lucy's phone number from her. Fingers trembling, Doris exhaled, hastily wiped a tear from her cheek with the palm of her hand, and dialed the right numbers. Hello, Lucy. You don't know me, but we need to talk. My name is Doris. I'm Claire's youngest daughter, and I want to give you my share of the inheritance.
Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Austin. Norman has been married to young Iris for a little over 5 years. The young girl's affair with the middle-aged man did not last long. Austin got used to married life. When his wife filed for divorce and asked to vacate their common house, it was as if the whole world turned upside down for him. Austin could not imagine his life without his family and children. He has to come to terms with the new reality. He also loves his son Eric very much. A couple years after the divorce, Austin was able to buy himself a house in an old village. After buying the house, the first thing he did was take his son Eric to live with him. Eric was very happy to live with his father. They had a lot in common. They communicate like best friends. After some more time, Norman told his son that he was tired of loneliness and wanted to get married. The acquaintance with his new fling took place in a restaurant. Eric hoped to see a woman about his father's age, but a bright young woman came to meet him. She seemed to be the same age as Eric or older by only a couple of years. She was also very pretty. At first glance, Iris seemed like a quiet, calm girl. But it wasn't until a few months later that it became clear to Eric that she wasn't so simple. There is definitely some kind of power in her that conquers people even with a silent look. Eric did not like it, because it was these properties Iris began to interfere with the relationship between father and son. The father began to devote little time to his son. And after all, he now has such a crucial moment in his life. He studies well at the university, began to develop his business in parallel. He really needs a good companion. And the father spends all his free time with his young wife. One day there was an event that made Norman reconsider his attitude to his son and to his young wife. Norman had his own brokerage firm, with an office located in the central part of the city. It was only an hour's drive from the township of Istock. After lunch, Norman felt that he didn't feel like working at all, so he decided to come home early, and he was not expected home at that moment. Change his shoes in the hallway. Norman heard Iris and Eric talking. "Eric, have you thought about the baby? He's gonna want to know the truth later. And anyway, I don't think it's fair," Boris said. "Don't worry, I'll think of something. The main thing is that nobody knows about it yet. By the way, how are things going with that issue? Any progress?" Eric asked. "I'm watching. Everything is going according to plan. No one's really trying to take your place," said Iris. At that moment, Norman came into the kitchen. Iris was happy to see her husband early and kissed him and invited him to the table. Eric was less friendly. He wished his father and stepmother a pleasant evening and left. Norman did not directly ask his wife the gist of the conversation. He decided to handle the matter professionally. A couple of weeks later, a private detective sat in Norman's office and laid out the photos in front of him. "Mr. Norman, we've been able to find out something. It is true that your son and your wife occasionally meet on neutral territory, but we can't yet say what they talk about or what their goals are. We need more time," said the detective. "Well, then keep watching. I expect details as soon as possible," Norman said. The village of Istock is located at the foot of the mountain. It doesn't have many residents, but it has its own atmosphere. There is a good tradition of planting perennial trees wherever possible. Thanks to this tradition, it is always beautiful here. The roads are paved with natural stone. Frequent rains wash away all the dust, car wheels so polish and these stones that they sparkle at any time of the day. Along the narrow village roads, wardens are set up in treacherous metal and painted in a single calm color. Residents make sure that the pupils' lamps are always clean and working properly. At every turn, along the narrow central road, gazebos made of OREWOD wood have been installed. True, rarely anyone sits there. The people of Stoke are mostly homebodies. They rarely gather outside and do not disturb each other without a reason. Houses are spaced far enough apart for lack of enemies and criminals. The fence here is decorative in nature. The gates are never locked. In the summer, Stoke constantly blows a light breeze, and in the evenings you can hear the flow of the mountain river, to which you can walk for 5 minutes. Along the river, there are green lawns everywhere, on which young people like to hold fun parties at night, and the villagers dislike these visiting parties the most. They disturb their sleep. At the entrance to the village, there is an old chapel, the history of which goes back to the Middle Ages. The chapel has been guarded by a lonely old man all his life. He died recently, and now his faithful four-legged friend, Box, roams around the chapel. But there is no one to watch over the chapel. The villagers have met several times and agreed to take turns guarding the chapel, but no one honors the agreement, and the need to honor the tradition is urgent. It is not even discussed. This is the only pressing problem of this village. There's a second problem for the village, and that's the car ball and Norman's son Eric. Eric was recently given a new Cadillac by his father. Now he drives his car day and night. Eric has a temper. He likes to make a ruckus and scandal out of nothing. The residents think it's because of his addiction to alcohol and other kinds of stupefied states of mind. But Eric lets everyone know that he doesn't like anyone even sober. Today, as luck would have it, it's Eric's turn to guard the chapel. Freddie, a local activist, has been chasing him around for a week, asking him to remember to come to the chapel in the evening and receive him properly. The other residents laugh at Freddie. How many times do you run after Eric? He still won't come to do this important tradition. Young people are irresponsible these days. They don't honor tradition, and they don't think about the future. This Eric will once again find an excuse to shirk his sacred duty. That's what the villagers of Listock thought. Eric didn't forget his sacred duty. Toward lunchtime, he drove his Cadillac to Freddie's house and asked him to keep the keys to the chapel. At precisely 5:00 p.m., I'll be waiting for you. There's a young man there, Freddie promised. No, that won't do. Come back at 4:00 p.m. I'll be ready to take chapel by then. Also, the next day, you don't have to be here by 900. How do you usually do it? You can come closer to lunchtime. I'm in no hurry to get anywhere, Eric said. Before, he was surprised at the untypical behavior of the local troublemaker, but he interpreted it as a good thing. Suddenly, the young man reconsidered his views and came to his senses. That happens to a lot of people. Everything happened as agreed. Only Freddie was awakened in the night by the screaming of the neighbors. Someone was yelling from the street to call the fire department and the paramedics. As Freddie pulled himself together and ran out of his house, all his neighbors were galloping away. Even yard dogs, small children, and sick old people were running. The chapel's on fire. That's bad luck. The chapel burned more than 180 years ago. Then it was the precursor to a series of floods. And the chapel burned before that, 234 years ago. Immediately after that event, there was a massive earthquake. And then there was a war. A wall and old men clutching at their hearts. That's not good. It shouldn't have happened. We should not have allowed such a significant disaster for our village. The women grumbled. Only Eric sat aside on the curb and took a slow drag on a Cuban cigar, stroking the figure of his friend, who had fallen asleep from the amount of liquor drunk right on the lawn. He had fun watching those pesky people stir and fuss in an attempt to put out the fire. The fools would have slept on. No chapel, no more trouble, thought Eric, and took a big gulp of whiskey straight from the neck of the bottle. The fire was out. People were starting to worry. Where was Norman's son Eric, who was an old-timer that evening? Had the young lad died inside the chapel? Norman had been against having anyone guarding the chapel from the beginning. Freddie had spent an hour talking him down, convincing him that the good traditions of the village must be preserved. How would Freddie look his friend in the eye now? The crowd was stirring again and actively discussing something among themselves. At this point, Eric decided to lie down and rest next to his girlfriend. Eric had hoped that after the fire, the villagers would have no more problems and each of them would live their own lives. But he had clearly underestimated them. 3 days later, they gathered again at the old church and began to discuss how they would rebuild the chapel and how they would protect it from fires. None of them realized that Eric had set the fire on purpose, and he would do it as many times as he wanted. Tired of arguing about rebuilding the chapel, the residents decided to disperse today, and the problem will be solved next weekend, when all the residents will feel in the appropriate spirit. Dispersing. Freddie and Norman walked down the main street. Norman hadn't been outside his garden for a long time. Today was the first time he had seen the outskirts of the settlement this year. There used to be an old abandoned house at the end of the street where no one lived. True, old Betty had told everyone that ghosts gathered in that abandoned house every night and held a coven. Nothing else is known about the house. The owners had either moved to town or sold the house. And today Norman noticed a new house 3 times the size of the old one has replaced the old one, and the roof is covered with pizza. In these areas, it was common to use broken skull structures, used by the most noble of families. Freddie, I don't get it. Are they building a new house here? Asked Norman. Don't you know what's going on? Freddie asked in a whisper. They say that the old haunted house bought the billionaire Edgar Nelson himself. He's going to move here, live here. They say he has a little time left. Freddie added. That's it. You're sure it's Edgar Nelson? Why did he choose our village? Asked Norman. Edgar shrugged his shoulders. Nelson was a hero of his era. This man is known for making a huge fortune in his younger years and doing a lot of good for society. After becoming an adult, he began to give lectures to students. Then people realized that Mr. Edgar was not only rich in money, but also in knowledge and wisdom. By his mature years, Edgar Nelson had become a true legend of his time. Even the most influential persons listened to his opinion. Without his participation, no important issue in the country was not solved. And so the people of this village were lucky to have him. Now this man of legend will be their neighbor. No matter how great a man he was, this Edgar Norman for some reason did not feel the joy of a new neighborhood, looking out for all the new residents. It's another tradition of this village. But Mr. Edgar would certainly win all the attention of the locals, and there's no telling what legends they'll start making about him. Norman came home with these thoughts. At that moment he again found his young wife Iris and his son Eric in the living room talking animatedly. Eric, feelings, emotions are all fleeting things. In such matters you have to think with your head and only then take action. You're still very young. You may not know the ins and outs of everything. So follow my advice, Iris says. I'm not only young, I'm handsome. Or don't you agree? Eric seems to be flirting with his stepmother, but it's undeniable. He's a handsome man, Iris tells him. As soon as they heard Norman's footsteps, the conversation stopped. Iris pretended that she had been waiting for her husband for a long time. Eric seemed to be going somewhere. He was dressed smartly and smelled of expensive perfume. It's a little different from his everyday outfit. Dad, you and I need to have a serious talk sometime, Eric said, when he got right to the front door. Let's talk now. I'm free now. While Iris is setting the table for us, said father. No, another time though. I'm expected now. I'll be late, said Eric, already closing the front door. His last words came from the street. Norman had been trying to keep his cool all evening and not show any signs of jealousy. And Iris kept asking him what he was so excited about and why he was so nervous. Norman only thought that tomorrow the first thing to do was to contact the detective and learn about the progress of surveillance of his closest people. He was afraid to think any further. Dude, why are you so sad? Asked Eric, his friend Jeffrey. As usual, they're out tonight at one of the bars in town. This is Eric Jeffrey's favorite place, his closest friend. Guys don't keep secrets from each other. You know what my home situation and prospects are like, Eric said. Still the same stepmother? Jeffrey asked. Yes, I'm trying to provoke her and find some reason for a scandal. But dude, it's not working. Eric's got his hands up in the air. What about Dad? Jeffrey asked. And he spends all his time with her, as usual. In all likelihood, they're even planning a child. She's young and will have more than one. And then what will be left to me? My father's accounts and business, so it's been losing value over the last few years. And if he has, say, 3 children, it's not an inheritance, But some change for me, Herrick said. So you can't get rid of your stepmother? Jeffrey asked. No, I'm not. I deliberately talk to her about delicate subjects so that she gets emotionally involved, so that my father will catch her flirting with me. Well, Dad doesn't see or hear all that, Eric said. And try a change of tactics. If verbal and provocation doesn't work on her, then try pretending that you have a crush on her as a woman. Show different signs of attention. Pretend that you are courting her. Trust me, women are addicted to these things. She's gonna let her emotions get in the way of your father. And that's when he'll kick her to the curb. Or maybe he'll think twice and decide to make up with your mother. After all, a woman of her age won't cause as much trouble as a younger woman. Jeffrey's advice. I was thinking the same thing. What if my father decides to take her side and makes an enemy of me? Then I'd lose my chance forever, Eric said. Even if he thinks that, it won't be for long. I know your dad. He's a normal dude. He understands a man's rules well. And men will never fight amongst themselves over a woman. Not even father and son. Even if he gets upset, it'll be for a while. And then you'll make up, Jeffrey said. Meanwhile, to Mr. Norman, the private investigator reported that the surveillance was continuing, but no significant clues could be found. Mr. Norman then decided to do a little investigation of his own. He invited his young wife Iris to a restaurant in the middle of a romantic evening. Norman as if casually began the conversation, Iris dear, I have long been unable to find time to spend with my son. I think he's growing apart from me. What do you think is going on in his life right now? Is there anything bothering him? Mr. Norman asked. That's right, you're really pulling away from him. I think he even blames me for all this, but he talks to me willingly, tells me about his girlfriends. He often consults with me about current affairs. I try to be friendly with him, but realize that no one can take your place in his life. So you should find a way to communicate with him at least once in a while, Iris replied. But overall, what do you think? He's not such a bad guy. I mean, the neighbors like to complain about his difficult personality. He's just like his mom. He's an adult. He can't be changed. Wouldn't his temper get in the way of his relationships with women? Norman asked a leading question. You've given him the best you can. Everyone has their strengths and weaknesses, including your son. I wouldn't say he's hopeless or unbearable. And the neighbors might say that out of jealousy. All in all, you have raised a fine son, Iris replied. After these words, Norman sank deeper into his doubts. His young wife speaks quite positively about his son. Can this be regarded as sympathy? Or is Iris just trying to be polite? Why did he overhear this conversation? The news that Mr. Edgar had already moved into his new home quickly spread through the village, the villagers looking out of their windows to catch a glimpse of the man of legend. The young people were arguing about which automobile he most often drove. This mysterious man interested all indifferent, nay, except Norman. And Iris was home alone when Freddie came in. You and your husband and his son Eric are invited to visit tonight, Freddie said. Secretary Edgar Nelson himself has become our new neighbor. He's throwing a banquet for his housewarming party tonight. He wants to meet everyone in the village, Freddie said. Iris got excited. She remembered the not-too-distant past, and Iris and her friends were just beginning their modeling careers. There was such a secret competition in their circle as dating the cool worms. The most self-confident models boldly put on their list of the most successful men in the country and did not miss a single social party to get acquainted with any of them. And Iris was one such huntress. She had tried several times to make her way into the society of this Mr. Edgar, but she had failed. Then she took a close look at him and decided that he was kind of boring for a legendary person. At the same time, Iris dated various promising guys until she met Norman, an entrepreneur. Unlike the young, spoiled by the female attention of guys, the mature Norman was reliable. He had then already converted his relationship with his wife into an amicable one. According to him, Sarah did not mind it at all. On the contrary, she was glad to finally have her freedom. It was Norman who suffered for family harmony and the usual way of life. That's how spontaneously Iris found herself married to a middle-class businessman. At the moment when she had time to get used to stability in relationships and predictability, right under the side appears such a trophy as Edgar Nelson. And he invites her to visit. Usually these people are very private. And Edgar must have decided that this village is home to ordinary people and not to be shut out. "Oh, honey, we're invited to a banquet tonight at our new neighbor's house," Iris announced over the phone. "Is that old geezer calling?" "No, I'll pass. I'm not gonna waste my time with a con artist like that," Norman said. "What makes you think he's a con man?" "It's all rumors and media speculation. They're usually people just like you and me." "Well, please, let's go." He invited Erica too, insisted, and through. After a long argument, Iris failed to persuade her husband to go together, but he agreed that she would go with Eric. They will briefly sit at the table, exchange a few phrases with this famous man, and then quickly return home. And Iris put on her best dress to meet her new neighbor. That's what all the other neighbors thought. In fact, all of her dresses were just as good. Mr. Edgar was surprisingly indifferent to women's beauty. He didn't even pay much attention to Iris. He thought someone had come with a teenage child. When the guests were served the second hot dish, Mr. Edgar asked for a moment of the audience's attention. Then he stood up and made a statement that left everyone speechless. "I am very happy to be a neighbor to such wonderful people. Believe me, I've lived in a lot of places, and I still do. I'm a pretty good judge of character. You're special. You make for a very interesting life. That's why I chose this village as my final resting place in this world. Few people know that I've been fighting an insidious disease for many years. I know that my outcome is near. Many people have a question about my inheritance. Who will inherit my money? I have no children and no other loved ones. I would like the honor of inheriting from one of you," Edgar said and paused. The guests froze, waiting for him to continue his speech. "But there is one interesting condition. I want to know two special persons among you. The best villager and the worst," said Edgar. The guests looked at each other and began to whisper among themselves. Some laughed, some were puzzled, some thought the old man was joking. "Mr. Edgar, how do you know who among us is the worst and who is the best?" asked the same curious Freddie. "Well, that's what we're going to talk about now. I will draw my conclusions from your feedback. From now on, and for the next 6 months, you can write me letters or come to a personal meeting to tell me about the worst and the best person among you. We will summarize the results in 2 stages. The first stage, in 3 months, we will determine the worst. That is, you can tell me about the worst person first, and for the next 3 months, you and I together will look for the best of the best," Edgar said. "What's the point of all this? Is it dismissive?" asked Eric, who until then had been sitting idly watching the others. "Good question, my friend. To the best of you, I will give $1 million, and whoever you appoint as the worst will have to guard your chapel for a year. By the way, I've allocated the money to restore it, and now it's a novelty. Do these conditions suit you?" Mr. Edgar asked. "Yes, it's a fascinating game." "I'm curious, why not?" Such phrases were heard from the crowd. Mr. Edgar understood that the audience accepted the terms of the game, and from tomorrow, all the most interesting things begin. And Iris came home in 2 bright feelings. Eric had been incredibly amused. What a quirky old man. He's obviously up to something and wants to fool everyone. And these gullible people believed him. He laughed. When he heard about the bet Mr. Edgar Norman had started, he was once again outraged. I guessed even from a distance that he is not the holy man he claims to be. He is a fraud and an imposter. He came here to sow confusion, grumbled Mr. Norman all evening, and was curious as to what would happen next. It was only a week before Minister Edgar's mailbox was full of letters. No sooner had he read them than people started coming to him themselves to tell him about the worst man in the village. The first was the very same Freddie, a local activist. He came with a whole list. So, Mr. Edgar, I have lived in this village for over 20 years, and I know every resident, and I know their whole background. If you're still interested, you listen. I'm very interested in Freddie telling me everything in detail. I want to know about everyone, Mr. Edgar said and stared at him. One of the worst people, I would say, is Norman Austin. He lives 3 houses down from you. Strange. I don't know anyone like that yet. Mr. Edgar wondered. That's right. He's a very secretive man, settled here only 3 years ago. He bought the house from some old people, remodeled it completely. He's lived here for 3 years, and none of us know anything about him. But we know he's got a young wife. He's got a son with a nasty temper. He's got a dog, that sort of thing. And the rest is a mystery. What exactly do you dislike about him? Mr. Edgar asked. All the other residents don't hide anything from each other. This one leaves early in the morning in his automobile as if from another planet. He arrives late. You don't see him around here much. In our community, normal men go out in the evenings and share the latest news, talk about soccer and women. This mister here is a little too mysterious. I think it's because he's got something to hide. There's a reason he changed his residence and his wife to a new one when he was older. He's obviously got some skeletons in his closet. That's why this man is first on my list. Freddie said. He'll pass, and that's it. Or do you have some kind of personal score to settle with this man? I have personal scores too. I asked him for a loan once. He gave it to me, but I paid him back in time. But you know, I think he gave it to me with such an arrogant look. He obviously thinks badly of us, of the other villagers. For example, when you had your housewarming party, he didn't come to you. Do you know why? Because he treats all people badly. That's another confirmation of what I said. Okay, who else is on your list? Minister Edgar asked. Next on my list is his son Eric, who is a big boy, but he's a troublemaker. His father bought him a brand new Cadillac. So this young man, instead of doing something useful, he rides around in that car all day long. He also tracks down the prettiest girls in our village, has fun with them a couple times, and then forgets about their fate. I suppose these girls will write to you about him in general too. This guy deserves the closest attention, Freddie said. Next on the list. Mr. Edgar listened attentively to his interlocutor. Next on the list is the worst person. I consider this Norman's young wife. And Iris is a model-looking girl who married a man who was old enough to be her father. I think she got together with him for a reason. It must be a matter of calculation. Immorality is a violation of morality. Freddie sounded like the leader of a political movement at a party meeting. Is there anyone else in your disfavor? Mr. Edgar remained at attention. Of course there is. It's our cop Andrew. He's not doing his job well. Mr. Edgar asked. No. No one has any complaints about his duties or his professionalism, but he's not friendly. A year ago, there was an accident at one of the houses. At that time, a cop, Andrew, was working 3 days straight at the house. Now, when I and other villagers came up to him and asked him about the details of the accident, he kept it from us. So this man clearly has bad thoughts about us and is carefully hiding it. So the fourth bad man in this village is a cop, Andrew. So we'll put that down. Who's next? Freddie was so engrossed in his list that he didn't realize a couple hours had passed. He came to his senses when he noticed Mr. Edgar falling asleep in his seat intermittently from his stories. Freddie thought that Mr. Edgar himself must not be such a good person if he couldn't even listen to his fascinating story about all the inhabitants. Mr. Edgar's next visitor was a woman named Grace, who has also lived in this village for over 20 years. She did not have a list. What she did have was the absolute certainty that she was the one who knew the worst person in the village. This is my ex-husband, Even, Grace said shyly. He left me with 2 kids and moved into his parents' old house. He lives there alone now. Sometimes he goes to church, sometimes he gets drunk and lies in the street. He absolutely refuses to live with us. Grace said, in all likelihood, Your ex-husband is really not a good man. What would you wish for him? Mr. Edgar asked. Can you not be shy in your expressions and thoughts? I guarantee full understanding, added Mr. Edgar. I would wish for him to suffer just as I suffered in my marriage to him. Oh, how? I thought you were suffering without him. Mr. Edgar asked. I suffer without him too, but I suffered with him too. The thing is, I married Ivan early on, but then he went to serve in the army, and from there he came back as a strange man. He lived with us for a while, and then he left. Minister Edgar listened carefully to Grace's words, and the former even wrote something down, then escorted the offended woman home. When there was another free time, Mr. Edgar unexpectedly came to visit the very one who abandoned his family and drags with different women. Ivan was home alone. He was taken aback by the unexpected guest of honor. In the house there are certainly empty bottles and dirty things lying everywhere. Ivan himself doesn't look like the happiest person in the world. While Mr. Edgar sat in Ivan's living room and watched the arrangement of his space, a certain woman came out of the next room with a perplexed look at Mr. Edgar, then headed sharply toward the exit. Ivan caught up with her and asked her something. Obviously, he wanted to keep her for a while longer, but the woman was in a hurry. Ivan, you and I have known each other for a while. I came to see you to get to know you better. How are you doing? Mr. Edgar asked, and he was at a complete loss. He was very worried about his reputation among people. His departure from the family was received with condemnation by the others. Everyone said he'd be lost without the support of the strong Grace. But Ivan had his own plans and his own vision of life. He was determined to prove something to the contrary. He needed a little time. Except this visit from Mr. Edgar was not a good idea. There's no telling what he'll tell the others about him. I've been doing all kinds of things. I live like everybody else. It's true I have some difficulties in my life, but I'll get over them. Ivan started making excuses. Don't worry, it's okay. Maybe you could get $1 million from me and rebuild your life. That's what I'm talking about. Your ex-wife came to see me. She thinks you're the worst person in the village because you abandoned your family and moved into your parents' old house. I was curious to see the worst man amongst my own. That is, in fact, what I am here, said Mr. Edgar in a soft tone. And Ivan sat silent for a long time. Mr. Edgar realized that he had stepped on something very painful for this man. He didn't expect the reaction to be so strong. He was clearly distressed about something. To be honest, my Grace wasn't telling you the whole truth. Finally, Ivan started talking. Actually, it all started when I came back from military service. It changed me a lot. I became very nervous, and I had a hard time tolerating others. My wife probably didn't tell you all this. I had a hard time sleeping at night. I kept waking up with nightmares. I told Grace I needed time and space to recover, but she thought I had fallen out of love with her. I walked away from my family to shut them out of my life. I knew that just a little bit more and I could hurt them, raise my hand, or start insulting them. I'm here to sort myself out, to become that calm and upbeat person. I don't know how to do that, but I believe that someday it will happen, and I'll get back to my loved ones. In the meantime, yes, I am a bad person. I know it myself, Ivan said and cried like a little child. Mr. Edgar sat in Ivan's house for a long time. Eventually he realized that this man had indeed become so small in his soul that he could not stand to be around other people. Mr. Edgar nodded his head repeatedly. When Ivan talked about himself, he had long ago guessed that some events, even insignificant at first glance, can make a person very small in his eyes. Such a person becomes quite embittered. Since the little beast inside is frightened, he is constantly on guard and cannot relax for a minute. Ivan turned out to be actually not a bad person, and unhappy Mr. Edgar promised to help him in the future. And for himself, he decided that the bad should be sought elsewhere. The next guests surprised Mr. and Edgar very much. There were about 10 of them. They were all teenagers of this village. We found out that you can be told about the best people of this village. If you don't tell our secret to anyone, "We are ready to point out the worst person to you," said one of the teenagers. Minister Edgar became very interested. He gave the teenagers the floor and sat in a chair with a pencil and paper in his hands. "All the adults in this village are the worst people in the world. They don't understand us. They think we are still children, but we are no longer children," said the first teenager. Then the second of them reached out his hand and stepped forward. Apparently, he too had a problem with adults. "And in some cases, we're asked to be adults, even though we're not adults," said the second teenager. "What do they want from you?" Mr. Edgar asked. The teens hesitated, and each began to list a different thing. "They want us to be able to do everything, everywhere. And we don't have any rights. They make us do things we don't like. They make us study subjects that won't do us any good in the future. It's as if they have forgotten that they themselves come from childhood. They steal our freedom and limit our development," the teenagers said with one voice. Mr. Edgar thought deeply. When he announced his bet, he didn't think the kids would be interested in it either. But since the rules were getting complicated, Mr. Edgar decided to accept them. He asked, "And can you specifically give me the names of people who can be categorized as the worst?" "That's my mom, Grace. That's my dad, Even, my dad, Freddie, my grandmother, Betty. Our neighbor, Norman's teacher, Ted, Mr. Cobb." It seems these young men and women have decided to list all the residents of this village in 3 generations. Mr. Edgar wrote down all the names and then thanked the young activists and escorted them out of his house. "The game is gaining very interesting momentum," he said to himself and shook his head. Mr. Edgar's next destination was the local school. There he got to know the teacher, Ted, better. Just that day, there was a school parent meeting. All the adults who had children, school children, were gathered in the hall. Ted addressed them and outlined a number of problems. They were typical of any school. Ted spoke very emotionally. One of the parents objected to him, demanding even more discipline than there is now. Then Ted said that children should be given more space for freedom, that they have the right to decide about their free time. He also talked a lot about the peculiarities of growing up. From time to time, he reminded the parents that they too were children and experienced difficulties. In the end, the impression was that Ted was completely on the side of the children. The parents were satisfied. For Mr. Edgar, it wasn't enough. After all the conversations, he stayed at the school a little longer and talked to Ted personally. Returning home, he was sure that Ted was not the worst person in the village, and the parents showed no signs of cruelty. But the children were right about something too. As Mr. Edgar gathered a history on each resident in the Norman household, something strange was happening, and Iris noticed that Eric had also spent all night last night at a nightclub toward morning, and had come in drunk, and was still asleep. In the morning, when Norman was leaving for work, he asked him to tell him to have Eric at his office by lunchtime, and Iris decided to give this to Eric closer to lunchtime. When she went into his room on the 2nd floor, Eric was already out of bed. "Eric, good morning. Your dad told me to tell you to report to his office. He said it was serious," Iris said, and hurried back out of his room. But Eric blocked her way. "Wait, Iris, you don't have to run away from me. If anyone needs to talk, it's you and me," he said and stepped closer to her. It was that awful moment that Iris had been dreading all along. She has been walking like the tip of a needle since the beginning of her married life, so as not to provoke this spoiled guy. Iris felt perfectly well that the previous frank conversations and attempts to draw out of her some emotions and other things are all tricks of this guy. She realizes that Norman frankly pays more attention to her and spends little time with his son. But the son never assumes that his father is doing this willingly. He sees his stepmother as a major rival. And yes, Eric is in close contact with his mother. She's probably there to give him a lot of pointers on how to gain more space in his father's life. Even though she has no intention of returning to her beloved husband, sharing his privileges with another woman is particularly reluctant, no matter how hard Iris tries to maneuver. Now she's on the verge of a major trap. "Eric, please don't cross the line. It will end badly for both of us." Iris tried to push him away from her and headed for the exit. "You think I'm a little kid and don't notice anything. I've been seeing it all for a long time. The way you've been grooming me from all sides. I know your plans are devious. You want to compromise me in my father's eyes. That's why I'm maneuvering like a knife edge. But you don't have to fear any of this if you obey me. I won't tell your father about your open provocations. If you stay close to me," Eric insisted. "What are you talking about?" "Eric, this is crazy. It's not my fault. Please stop acting like a capricious child." Iris was getting seriously worried. "What kind of provocation are you talking about? I'm only trying to be on friendly terms with you. You and I have one person in common. He's close to you and me. What makes you think I have a personal affection for you?" Iris raised her voice to you. "Oh, come on. Your flashy outfits, your clever facial expressions, your smiles. I've been noticing it for a long time. Don't worry. No one will ever find out." Eric continued to hold Iris' hand. After a short verbal altercation, Iris gathered all her strength into a fist, and she managed to break free from Eric's hands. She ran swiftly down the stairs until she took one wrong step and rolled headlong down the stairs. Eric heard a rumble and ran out following her down the stairs, and there lay the girl's frail body with blood running from her nose. Eric came running and picked her up and put her on the couch in the living room. He was terrified. He had no idea how to give a person help in cases like this. In a hurry, he ran into the kitchen, struggled to find the home first aid kit, but it contained only neatly folded bandages and nothing else. So Eric ran to the phone to call a doctor. But he realized that the doctor would not arrive here soon. It was almost an hour's drive from the city to the village. Eric decided to drive Iris to the hospital in his car. Why did I listen to Jeff? She was the one who fell down the stairs when she was scared of me. I wasn't really going to touch her. What kind of day is this? Thought Eric as he stepped on the gas of his car. Meanwhile, Iris's face had turned blue and tinged, and her body was hanging out of the back seat of the car like a bag of vegetables. When my father finds out, I can't avoid trouble. She might tell him why she ran up the stairs like that, too, right? Eric thought, and he felt even more uneasy. Meanwhile, Mr. Edgar's experiment continues. Several people come to him every day to tell him the worst behaviors and traits of their acquaintances, friends, or just fellow villagers. And Edgar was greatly surprised when a group of teenagers came to him. He hadn't expected such an active response. And today, he was even more surprised when a local cop came to see him. Turns out he knows who the worst person in this village is. Mr. Edgar, I know how to end crime in any community. It takes the good work of the so-called vice squad. In this case, it's the rector of the church. And instead of educating people, he collects money from the church and organizes religious festivals. Meanwhile, people often steal, beat each other up, damage each other's property, all because the churchmen are not doing their duties well enough. I don't think God will forgive him for that either. He himself says, "It is better to receive his punishment on earth than in heaven after death." I followed his idea of appointing him the worst inhabitant of this village, and let him do the dirtiest work in our village. It will be better for him than burning in hell after death, the cop said. Minister Edgar listened attentively and was struck by the depth of Kova's arguments. "You have been another revelation to me," Mr. Edgar said, and wrote down all of Kova's arguments in his notebook. Hearing such a serious accusation, Mr. Edgar decided a few days later to visit the churchman in person and talk to him. When he arrived, indeed, the church was empty, with no one present. "Father, why is there no one in the church on the day of service?" Minister Edgar asked. "You know, these are the times. People have turned away from God. They have sold their souls to the devil and become dependent on the poor world, and they don't have the time or energy to go to church. A couple of years ago, one of the active ones even proposed to demolish this church and build a nightclub instead. God save us from such a thing," said the rector and crossed himself. "Are you saying that people have forgotten about God?" Mr. Edgar asked. That's exactly what I'm saying. But it's not their fault. God loves people infinitely. The proof of this love is the fact that he gave mankind the devil. What are you saying, Father? How does that make sense? How can the devil be a gift to human beings? Minister Edgar marveled. It's very simple. God gave the devil so that man could blame all his sins on him. It is a great opportunity to repent every time after committing a sin and every time to return to the abode of the Holy Father, said the abbot. Yes, you're right. There is something in it. Father, may I ask you a question? Mr. Edgar asked. I'm all ears. One of the important people in this village came to see me yesterday. If you know, I recently asked the people of this village to identify the worst person among them. Well, this important man thinks the worst person is you. Do you know why? Because you don't preach well enough, and people fall into sin through ignorance, said Mr. Edgar. A fellow cop pressed me. It was expected. We have an old conflict with this man. When I was a young man, there lived in our neighborhood an unprecedented beauty named Area. I was young, handsome, educated, and rich, and a fellow cop at the time was starving. Both of us were attracted to this beautiful girl Area, but the beautiful maiden chose me as her beau over the cop. He and I have been secret enemies ever since, so don't believe a word he says against me. It's because of youthful resentment and jealousy, the priest said. Ah, that's how it is. Interesting story. As far as I know, you are now living about a beautiful girl. Arise no, in your life. Mr. Edgar asked. Yes, that's right. My love turned out to be miserable. I didn't know who I was involved with. This beautiful girl turned out to be a companion. I found out about it very late. When I found out, I was already hopelessly fixed with her. I did everything I could to get her on the right path and stop sinning. But all was in vain. Suffering from heart itches, I acquired a host of diseases, body and mind. And in the end, she left me anyway and chose a licentious lifestyle. She still hosts rich gentlemen to this day. When I look at all this, I am weak and feeble. On days like this, I'm not even able to preach, the priest said. Father, do you think this is a beautiful area, good man or bad man? Mr. Edgar asked. How can a companion and a traitor be a good person? My whole life has gone down the drain because of her. Even now, after she is long gone from my life, she continues to live in the house across the street and do dishonor to me. Every time I look at her, I feel how far from holiness I am, the priest said, and his voice became agitated. Mr. Edgar had a very interesting picture in his mind. Mr. Edgar had a very interesting picture in his mind. The culprit was a certain grandmother who had led a vicious life many years ago in her distant youth. Now we should talk to this beautiful girl. Area thought to himself, Mr. Edgar. A few days later, he visited this woman by name. He expected to see a beautiful girl, but he made a slight mistake in his introduction. The now beautiful girl had turned into a charismatic woman of mature age. From the looks of it, you couldn't tell that she was the source of the falling morals of this entire village. Area greeted her guest in a very flirtatious manner. I heard that an honorable gentleman like you has settled in our village. I've been looking for a chance to get to know you. And this is such an unexpected, pleasant meeting, she said. I've never heard anything about you. I wonder why your fellow villagers didn't mention a fine woman like you. Mr. Edgar got in on the act. That's a good thing. I know a lot of them are jealous of me. They're afraid that all your attention will be on me. They only want to make the most of you on their own account. And how are you doing? How is your life going? Mr. Edgar asked, slowly looking around the interior of Aries' dwelling. Everything here spoke for itself. The fiery red walls hinted at passions. On the wall are elegant candle holders with candles blazing and a light fragrance. On the table are 2 sparkling glasses waiting for the clear wine that Apple always has in stock. Nearby lie some other sweets in beautiful wrappers. The woman herself is dressed in a long, cool robe, from behind which her seductively long legs brazenly peek out. I live my life as best I can. I've been judged for my lifestyle, of course, but I once made the decision not to resist my desires. That's why my paths went in different directions with the local church rector. He aspired to the sublime, and I epitomized the niche, Aria said and grinned. That's actually something I'd like to talk to you more about. Why do you want to talk about all this? Aria asked. That's a very good question. Are you the first person to ask that? The others chose to join in silently. Mr. Edgar said, You should know that I achieved everything many years ago, a long time ago. I have no need to think about my daily bread. All my worldly questions are solved for 3 generations ahead. When I had achieved all this, I asked myself, what do I want next? It was an excruciatingly difficult question. Usually, when people reach the top, there is a precipitous downward slide afterward. I knew this and feared it. After much agonizing reflection, I found the answers in my soul. I want to know human nature. From that moment on, and my already beautiful life was completely transformed. My wealth became less important. It became important for me to see something in each person that others don't have. My game of determining the best and the worst also comes from this. I wonder how you could have come straight to me. I would have told you right away what each person is like. All my life, I've yet to meet a man who can hear the truth about himself and not run away from it. I've never met anyone like that. I see you're already looking forward to that kind of knowledge, Aria said. You are quite right. People prefer to avoid themselves all the time. I've seen that time and time again, by putting them through various realistic tests. Following the rules of my game, I recently visited the church rector. He told me that you broke his heart and became a sacred wound in his life. Because of this, he cannot become truly holy and lead others to holiness. So the worst person in this village is you. Do you agree with that? Mr. Edgar asked. He was a little worried that the woman might be offended or angry, but Aria remained calm, just as cheerful. But finally Aria exclaimed and clapped her hands together. At last these people have begun to think, albeit with your help. They're finally thinking about who is truly good and who is truly bad. I hope this knowledge will help them to be truly happy. I always said that I was the worst person not only in this village, but in the whole world, Aria said and threw her hands to her sides. And Edgar was surprised. It was the first time he had ever seen a man speak of his unhappy plight with such joy and pride. He decided not to interrupt the lady. In fact, they all want to live like I do every morning, to make themselves beautiful, to put on the most beautiful clothes, to stay at home and fool around all day with breaks to eat good food, drink good wine, and meet only such people who come for real pleasures. They cannot even in their wildest dreams afford my daily life. I am at my lowest standards, and I am also paid generously for it. I have no worries except to look seductive and be in a good mood. That's my shortcoming. Did your church rector, when he was my life partner, truly hate me for it? I realized at that time that I did not have the strength and desire to strive for higher things as he did. Therefore, I did not cling to him and our life together. I let him go to his aspirations of his soul. If he is suffering now, it is because he would like to live his life as I do, but he did not find the strength for it. But he skillfully pretends to be the truest and most honest man in this village, Maria said. Is there anyone you can call the worst person in the village, other than yourself? Edgar decided to clarify, since this was the first time he had encountered such honesty. No, of course not. They're all good people. The other thing is me. I think I'm the worst person in the world because of the way I live my life. And the proof of that is the fact that I'm also proud of it and not pretending to be different from who I really am, Aria said. This interesting conversation went on for quite some time, and Edgar was quite surprised. He had met 1,000 different people in his life, but he had not met someone like this woman very often. On his way home, he met Freddie. He asked about the results of the experiment. Secretary Edgar, how's your research coming along? We need to determine who will guard the chapel as soon as possible, he said. I'm afraid your expectations will fail. The man who, by your standards, has turned out to be the worst of you is not fit to guard the chapel. She's a promiscuous woman. She's admitted it herself. But why not a teacher? Why not a priest? Why not a cop? Or even Norman? Freddie asked in surprise. Because they don't recognize themselves as such. And as long as a man thinks someone else is bad, he doesn't see the bad part of himself. That was my personal theory, and once again it was confirmed. And the results will be quite surprising to you. Mr. Edgar said. That was the end of his experiment. Now he knows everything about the inhabitants of this village, and the worst of them is the unremarkable Rasputin, a woman who lives on the outskirts of the village. But that's the crowd's version. Meanwhile, Iris has only been in hospital for 3 days. Norman was away on a business trip that day, and Iris decided not to say anything about what had happened so that her husband would not worry. But she didn't tell Eric anything about it. He was worried that his stepmother would get into trouble with his father. That's why all these 3 days did not leave the door of the hospital, taking care of stepmother. Through anger and hatred for her, the address was written out the day before Norman came home. She greeted her husband as if nothing had happened. Only Eric avoided seeing his father. He stayed out of his sight for days, and when he finally calmed down, he decided to continue his offensive toward his stepmother, to get rid of her. That afternoon, it was just the two of them at home again. Iris was busy with household chores. She now became very careful, does not enter the room where Eric is sitting, trying to stay on the first floor of the house so that in case of danger to escape, someone knocked on the gate. And since she went to open it, in front of her stood Mr. Edgar. What an unexpected encounter. Hello. If you remember, you and I are neighbors. My name is Mr. Edgar. Yes, of course I remember. How could anyone forget you? It came out of Iris' mouth. If you'll allow me, I'd like to be your guest for a while. Is that possible? Mr. Edgar asked kindly. Yes, of course. Come in. We are not at home, but his son and I are. By the way, Eric is also interested in your achievements and biography. And before I knew it, I was floating in front of this gentleman. At home, Mr. Edgar carefully examined the situation, periodically asked different questions, and I was surprised by the curiosity of this man. It was said about him that he had a cool disposition and a very unpredictable character. And now he was acting like one of the most typical people in this village. As for Eric's interest, Iris certainly embellished a bit. He was just as skeptical as his father that a legendary millionaire, a scandalously famous man, was their new neighbor. And when Eric learned that he had thought up some kind of experiment among the residents, and the winner guaranteed $0,000, he laughed it all, considering it for nonsense. Hearing the conversation in the living room, Eric decided to go downstairs and see who had come to see them. Seeing Mr. Edgar, Eric was a little displeased. Eric Nelson, I've heard a lot about you, kid. How you doing? Why don't you come sit down and talk to us? Let's get to know each other like buddies. Edgar said hello. What brings you here? I like to meet new people. I thought I'd drop by. I was told there were some wonderful people living here, Edgar said. Well, they lied to you. I can tell you the truth. There are no great people here. My father lives here, who left his wife and 3 children and left home. His young wife lives here, a former model and a bit of an actress in life. She is, in fact, sitting in front of you. It's also where myself and Norman's no-good son live. A drunk, a spoiled bully, and a rebel. Which one of us is the most wonderful? So don't believe these people from our village, said Eric. Do I like you, boy? That's what they told you about that too. Besides, most of your fellow villagers think you are the first candidate for the worst person in this village. Is it encouraging that you know the truth? Mr. Edgar grinned. In fact, you've been up to an idiotic thing. I know you actually have other goals in mind. At the very least, you want to turn all the residents against each other, and none of them are getting any of the $1 million. Now, I don't understand why you're doing this. If you were a woman, I'd be sympathetic. Only women are interested in such things, Eric said. Iris felt embarrassed that Eric was being so insolent toward such an important man. Edgar noticed it too. Eric, you're free to think as you see fit, but my truth remains the truth. You'll see, someone will get $1 million from me, and I'll do it in front of everyone else, and someone else will have to watch and care for the old chapel all year. Could it be you? I'm ready to get started today, because I know how to solve this trifling problem once and for all. Tomorrow morning, these people will have the ruins of their chapel again. Now that's the normal solution, Eric said. As much as Mr. Edgar tried to build a dialogue, he failed to connect with Eric. In all likelihood, the other residents are right. This Tarek is really unfixable, he thought, while he looked at Iris carefully and pondered Eric's words. The former model is a bit of an actress. Should be an interesting match for a little fling. Such a thought flashed through his mind, but he quickly switched to other conversations. It was a very ordinary family evening in Norman's household, and Iris was setting the table. Eric woke up. Recently, Norman wanted to talk to his son, but he promised that all the talk would be later, and Eric himself, out of habit, rushed to his friends, who had already planned entertainment for that night. But that was just an excuse. Or tonight he had important business to attend to, and he did not intend to be distracted by entertainment. As Norman and Iris sat at the table, someone knocked on the door. Iris went to open the door. In front of her stood a middle-aged man of tall stature, stylishly dressed and smelling good. He was holding a bouquet of flowers and a large box with a ribbon. "Hello, darling. It's okay that I came to see you so unexpectedly." "Really, I called at night, and you didn't pick up," said the strange man. Then put his arm around Iris's waist and kissed him vigorously on the lips. "Excuse me, who are you?" asked Iris, when with difficulty managed to get out of the strange man's embrace. "Yes, stop pretending. Or is this some kind of game?" "Well, if you're getting me into the game, then I don't mind at all. I know how good you are in different roles," says the man, and again with a kiss, and Iris pushed him away with difficulty. "Men, I don't know you. Leave me alone and go away." She resented him. "I understand. Baby, you missed me. Is it okay for a sweet little thing like you to be cranky? You said so yourself on the phone." And then she got mad. She wanted to yell at the man, but he's unpredictable. His behavior clearly raises a lot of questions. The struggle went on for quite some time. The unfamiliar man would not admit to being a stranger. When Norman heard shouting and cursing, he also left the house. Turns out that's what this is all about. "Hello, Mr. Norman. And Iris, dear. Now I can see why you've been so angry. But I think it's time we told your husband the truth. How long can you and I hide?" says the man. "Norman, I don't know him. This is the first time I've seen this man. Please don't take his word for it. I have nothing with him." And Iris was almost crying. The more Iris explained herself, the more insolent the strange man behaved. He tried to keep her close, to hold her in his arms and press her against him. Norman saw that in the strange man's hands was a bouquet of Iris's favorite flowers and a box of red, just the way she likes it. "I don't understand you. What do you want in my house?" Norman was trying to figure out what was even going on. "The thing is, Iris and I love each other. I've been telling her to come clean for a long time, but she feels sorry for you. She thinks you'll figure it out and let her go. It's a good thing you saw for yourself. You shouldn't have any questions now," the strange man said. "No, none of this is true. This is the first time I've ever seen this man," screamed Iris, and she was almost hysterical. Norman stood there in complete incomprehension. "I got it right. Iris is very afraid of you. I will leave you both to accept the new reality. Mr. Norman, I hope you don't see the woman you and I love. And with you, my dear, we'll call you in the next few days," said the stranger. The man left his gifts on the threshold and left leisurely. Turning the corner, the strange man took out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Eric, buddy. Mission accomplished. Cool. You made all this up. You should have seen the look in your stepmom's eyes. I think she's gonna get a good kick out of your father." He was almost on edge, but as a well-mannered man, he could barely control himself, said the strange man. "Rome, you have an underrated acting talent, and I've always believed in you. Thanks, buddy. Now come on, get a cab, and come to us. Is your reward waiting for you?" Eric answered him. Old man Edgar called Freddie to his house again today. He hadn't been in the village for a long time. Now he decided to make up for lost time. "It seems that you and I have some important business to attend to. Gather all the villagers. I have something to tell them," Edgar said. Hearing the new invitation, the villagers hurried back to Igor's house. Of course, the rich table and the exquisite treats were interesting to them. But even more interesting, who did Edgar decide to appoint as the worst person? Who is the one who will now carry the stigma of disgrace for an entire year? Every resident is sure that Edgar made his decision with exactly his advice in mind. When the whole village gathered and enjoyed the rich treats, with these, Mr. Edgar again asked for everyone's attention. "If you remember, I was announcing a little experiment. I have gathered you here today to summarize the preliminary results. I have found that there are no sinless among you. Some of you have brought me lists of bad people. Some of you have come to me several times to convince me of your vision. Some of you I myself have personally gone to and tested how bad you are. Before I announce my decisions, I would like to ask you to express your guesses as to which of you will hold the title of the worst man in the village." Mr. Edgar added more intrigue. The guests glanced amongst themselves. Mr. Edgar looked at each of them, waiting for them to respond. But no one was in a hurry to offer an opinion. "Come on in, maybe you have an opinion." Mr. Edgar turned to one of the most active participants in his experiment. "Mr. Edgar, I have lived in this village for over 20 years, and I know everyone. Each of them has their own faults and virtues. I think each of my fellow villagers is well aware of their peculiarities. I believe that I have no right to interfere in such aspects of their lives, so I have nothing to add," Freddie said. Mr. Edgar nodded his head approvingly. He had conducted such experiments many times before. He knew for a fact that the participants would say different words depending on the situation. Freddie, for example, he was one of the most active participants who brought whole blacklists. And when all these people were gathered around the same table, he very politely recanted his words. "Father, perhaps you have something to say. As the spiritual leader of this community, you know more than anyone. Do you think there is a fault in people or some of the unpleasant things that are happening in our community? Is it the work of the devil himself?" Mr. Edgar turned to the priest. The priest was clearly not ready for a frank conversation at the table. Both good and bad come from the man himself. If he has a connection with the Lord God, then of course his thoughts will be pure. But if a person has not gone off the right path and has turned down the path of sin, then shame and dishonor will not escape him. Our Lord guaranteed that bad deeds will be hidden from his eyes. He promised to help spread the glory in every way possible until the person himself began to tell others about them. And our good deeds, following that, I would prefer to remain in the shadows, the priest said. The man once more confirmed Mr. Edgar's supposition. "Before, why don't I see Mrs. Area among the guests?" asked Mr., remembering the beautiful mature woman leading a Rasputina lifestyle. The priest shuddered. He was worried that this millionaire for fun and laughter might tell his dramatic story with this Rasputina woman. He perked up, looking around. Freddie was also taken aback, but not confused. Minister Edgar, Aria's companion, said she had other plans for tonight. But she promised that she would be sure to visit you at the first opportunity, Freddie said. After that, Freddie and the priest looked at each other. The priest nodded his head slightly. That meant that he would not be indebted. No one knew that the priest had set a condition for Aria not to attend this evening. Therefore, Freddie had not even informed her of Mr. Edgar's invitation. It was further proof of the man's hypocrisy, but she remained out of Mr. Edgar's sight. Instead, he abruptly changed the topic of conversation and turned his attention to the treats for the guests. The crowd, which had been curiously awaiting the name Shame, Nika was left bewildered. Apparently, it would have to wait a while longer for the name of that unfortunate man to be announced. The guests ate, drank, talked among themselves, amused themselves. From the outside, one would have thought that the villagers had no grievances against each other. As the evening drew to a close, one of the guests lost patience. "Minister Edgar, we've already guessed that you've invited us here for an important occasion. We know you're going to announce the name of the unfortunate one who was the worst of us. What is your choice? Who have you determined to be the best?" The man asked. "That's a good question. I was expecting it," Edgar said, and rose from his seat. He walked around the long table where all his neighbors were sitting. Every guest's gaze was fixed on him. "This is not the first time I have conducted an experiment here. As you know, I am a very wealthy man. I buy houses in different cities and towns. Among them, there are gated elite areas, and there are youth neighborhoods. They are located in different countries. Every time I settle in a new place, I organize some miracle contest. And you know, every time, the results are exactly the same. They're similar even in the smallest details. Is that interesting to you? Or should we stop here?" Mr. Edgar stopped and asked the guests. The guests expressed their willingness to listen to him further. They still had not given up hope of hearing the name of the worst man among them. Each one of them was sure that it was definitely not him. Meanwhile, Mr. Edgar continued his story. "So let it be known to all of you that he came to me with a list of the worst people, each and every one of you. And let it be known that each and every one of you has been repeatedly listed by others as the worst person. So there is no point in singling out a particular person. The point of my experiment is for you to realize that no one is a saint. You should also remember that there is always someone who is against you. I don't know what you should do with this knowledge, but you must always remember that from another's point of view, each of you stands on the same level," said Mr. Edgar. "And who will guard the chapel?" asked one of the guests. "That's for you to decide. How did you usually do it before?" Mr. Edgar asked. The guests became sad at first, and then even a little indignant. They came here for the spectacle, and to them, this man read them a moral. Mr. Edgar noticed the mood of the crowd. To lighten the mood, he asked his servants to bring a new batch of fine food and good wine. But the guests were no longer as lively as they had been at the beginning of the evening. When dessert was served, Mr. Edgar again asked for the audience's attention. "As you know, that was only the first part of the contest. There is still a second part. Now I am waiting for your feedback on the best person among you. And it's gonna be even more exciting than it was before. And remember, you only have 30 days. You may not nominate yourself as the best person. It has to be another person from this village, the one the others say is the best. In exactly 30 days, $1 million will come out of my hands right in front of your eyes. Are you ready?" Mr. Edgar turned to the audience. The guests looked at each other and thought again. What a challenge. This time Iris didn't attend the dinner party at Mr. Edgar's house. Those were not the easiest days of her life. After a strange man visited unexpectedly with a bouquet of flowers and gifts, Norman had many questions for his young wife. Barely escorting the annoying stranger out, they both returned to the house as soon as they crossed the threshold. Iris began to explain herself. "Norman, honestly, this is the first time I've seen this man. Do you really think I'm capable of treason? I don't know what that person wanted, but I certainly had nothing to do with it." Norman was silent for a long time in response. If he had been passionately watching the news on television before, now all his thoughts were occupied with something else. He did not respond to his wife's words, only stared thoughtfully at one point. "I suppose this man could have mixed up the address," said in a quiet voice as she tired of her husband's heavy silence. "It's possible to mix up an address, but damn it, he knows you. He brought your favorite peonies, And the sweets you love. How do you explain that to me? Norman finally gave it up. I can't explain it. If you believe me, then help me understand this situation, said Iris. Many people told me that my young wife might be cheating on me. I've dismissed such nonsense every time. But for some reason in my life, more and more facts hint at something bad, said Norman. Who's telling you these things? Maybe these people have set such a trap for me. Why didn't you tell me that in the first place? And what facts are you talking about? I've cheered up. Never mind all that. In fact, I've been wanting to talk to you about my son for a long time. I overheard you and him talking the other day. You were talking about some kid. Then I overheard you talking about something very personal. What is that supposed to mean? Norman exploded. You heard a snippet of our conversation about Eric's friend's girlfriend. Your son Eric tells me all the time about the adventures of his friends. This time he relayed that his friend Jeffrey doesn't know what to do with his friend who got him pregnant. Jeffrey, who's a frequent visitor. That's who we were talking about. Do you have any more questions? Iris shuddered with anger at her husband. Why do you have so many private conversations with him anyway? I'm just trying to keep up a polite dialogue with him. He tells me stories. I share my opinions. You barely talk to him at all. You just give him commands. The rest of the time, you pay him off with money. Didn't you think the boy needed your support and company? Why should I support your relationship? Yesterday, Iris finally came clean. He's not a boy. He's 23 years old, and he's about to become the manager of my company. He's not a girl to be handled and listened to all the time. And I give him enough money to make him feel free. He needs to make connections. He needs to find his place in a certain circle where money is very important. Any other questions? Now Norman exploded. I was very offended. That you thought ill of me and my son. Do you even hear what you're accusing me of? Said Iris. How am I supposed to think when a strange man comes straight to my house with gifts and kisses you on the lips? What else am I supposed to think? The verbal altercation turned into a long family scandal. When the spouses were tired of yelling at each other, Norman decided to end the conversation. Now, my dear, I'm giving you 3 days' time. During that time, you and I will not discuss or fight. During that time, you will think hard about how you and I are going to proceed. Either I have to stop getting facts that compromise you, or you have to make a choice, Norman said. What do you mean, make a choice? Iris asked. It means you're going to choose either me or that strange man. So you're suggesting that I break up with you. We can break up because you don't believe what I say, and you believe whoever you want. Iris asked, through tears. And if you want that not to happen, then please give me a reasonable explanation for what's going on, not empty excuses. I'm done. And by the way, which one of us is sleeping in the living room? You or me, said Norman last. I said Iris quietly. When Eric suddenly ran out of money at the restaurant, he was a little upset. The task turned out to be quite unfortunate. He was just about to take his friends to a nightclub after the restaurant. It would take a decent amount of money. So he turned to his friend Jeffrey. How about you pay for everyone tonight? And tomorrow I'll pay you the full amount for the movie, Eric asked. I'm sorry, buddy, but you know I don't have that kind of money. Besides, you invited everybody. You're going to have to do a lot of work yourself, my friend said. Are you right? I don't have any money on me. We'll have to go home. Tell the girls we're going out for a while. Have them wait for us here, and you and I will go to my house, said Eric. After half an hour, Eric and Jeffrey sneaked into the house. They didn't know that Iris was lying down in the living room. Eric carefully opened his father's safe, while Jeffrey stood in the hallway. After a few moments, Jeffrey turned to his friend. Eric, I feel like I'm being drawn to sleep. Do you have any coffee? Let's have a quick drink. It's going to be a little hard to drive, said his friend. Now they moved into the kitchen. The kitchen and the living room are separated by a thin partition, so even whispers can be heard from here. When the coffee was ready, the boys sat down at the table and chatted among themselves in whispers. "So is your father still hung up on that woman?" Jeffrey asked. "Unfortunately, yes, but it won't last long. Your advice didn't work. I came up with a cool way to do it myself. Last week, I approached Roma with a bouquet of flowers and gifts, so he could pretend to be my stepmom's lover. And that's when my dad was home," Eric said. "Wow, you're a genius, man. So, what are the results?" "Your dad probably kicked her out the door," asked Jeffrey with a chuckle. "What's the matter with her? She's still hanging around. I think she managed to convince my father of her sainthood. We'll have to do it again in the next few days." "Then she won't stand a chance," Eric said. Then they stoked their coffee, turned off the light, and quietly closed the door behind them. Neither of them even realized that Iris was lying just behind the partition during this time, in agonizing thoughts about her position in this family. After the boys left and Iris got up from her seat and lit a cigarette in the kitchen, she was calm now. A brilliant idea popped into her head: how to come out of this situation victorious. She decided to spring into action tomorrow. Mr. Edgar had taken a few days' leave to devote to his neighbors, who would come with suggestions for the best man among them. He remembers the last time he had to determine the worst. Several people came to him every day. He thought it would be the same this time. For the first 3 days, no one came. Then Mr. Edgar went to Freddie and asked if everyone was okay. Freddie wondered, why such questions? Has everyone forgotten that $1 million is at stake? "I'm waiting for the candidates," said Mr. Edgar. "Is that what you mean? I don't even know why no one comes." Freddie shrugged. "Well, Freddie yourself, who would you say is the best person among your neighbors, relatives, friends, and fellow villagers?" "I'm sure you have some," Mr. Edgar said. "I can't think of any." "Think back. Maybe you've had some rough times in your life. Someone reached out to you. Someone gave you a kind word of encouragement. Just one person." Minister Edgar insisted. "No, I don't remember anyone like that." "Mr. Edgar, I grew up an orphan. I made it on my own. Built my own house, planted my own garden, bought my own van, started my own farm. Of course, there were many times I wished there was someone in my life who could solve all my problems, or not solve all the problems. But to come along and say, 'Freddie, you take a couple weeks off and enjoy yourself, and I'll do it for you,' that's a big deal." "No, that never happened," Freddie replied. "Are you saying that all the people around you are indifferent?" Mr. Edgar asked. "Mr. Edgar, why do you like to ask such meticulous questions? Are people as they are, and is it unfair to divide them into good or bad? I mean, the same person can be different from one person to the next. Sometimes he can act like the ultimate scoundrel. Sometimes he can act like a wise man. Do you really think your stupid experiment is going to do anyone any good? I think you're just doing this nonsense because you've got nothing else to do." Freddie got mad. "You mean Freddie? I don't really have anything else to do, so I study people. And the results of my experiment will not go to waste. I'm writing my book, and in it I'm describing all sorts of silly things in your language. You know what's interesting? You were the most active last time, weren't you? Why are you criticizing my experiments now?" Mr. Edgar asked. "I don't know. Maybe because it all annoys me. If your money bothers you, you could give it away for nothing. What do you care who or what anyone thinks of the man? Or are you just gonna bluff Freddie?" "No, he's not bluffing. There are already several people who have gotten their $1 million out of my hands. There's been a lot of press about it. You can look it up. But it's too bad you're not participating this time." "Too bad," said Mr. Edgar, and headed leisurely to his home. Over the next few days, Mr. Edgar went around to all the neighbors with the same question: "Who do you think is a good person?" It was as if the neighbors were all in agreement. They refused to discuss the subject. And when Mr. Edgar asked them if their reluctance to talk might be due to shame for having slum mudded many of their acquaintances last time, some of them threw him out of their homes. Minister Edgar was used to such displays, so he took no offense. But not everything was so hopeless. After he was kicked out of the church by the minister, he was caught up on his way home by that nice and sweet neighbor Iris. "Mr. Edgar, if you're not in a hurry, listen to me. Is there someone I can tell you about?" said he as he ran after him. "Well, that's interesting. Come on, let's go home," said Mr. Edgar, and they came to his well-maintained yard where there were wooden gazebos, and Iris was the first to speak. "I am aware that you have announced the second part of your experiment. Is that correct? Do you have someone to praise?" asked the old man. "Yes, I have someone to praise. The best man in our village is called Eric. He is my husband's son. True, Eric is a bit spoiled, but he has a pure soul and pure thoughts. Choose him as the winner. You won't regret it," Iris said. "I suppose so. And how can you justify such a flattering characterization of your stepson?" Mr. Edgar asked. And then Iris wondered. All she remembered about her stepson was his dirty molestations, provocations, threats, and even his latest setup with a strange man. She doesn't remember anything else he did. But now we have to answer the old man's question somehow. "You know, I don't really have anything to back that up. I just don't think Eric's personality is quite there yet. He's got his best stuff dormant inside of him. And if you give him a little push, everything will fall into place. My stepson will bring out his best," Iris said. "Well, have I written down your feedback? Let us now wait until the end of the appointed time," replied Mr. Edgar lastly. After this conversation, Iris had a nice chat with the millionaire for some more time and then went back home. True, neither of them guessed that their conversation had been inadvertently overheard by someone in the immediate neighborhood. The news that the agitated son of the unloved Norman was claiming to be the best man quickly spread among the residents. Victor, the first to hear about it, was Freddie. He couldn't stand Norman's son. When he imagined that this pompous guy would be called the best, he lost his temper. He wanted to go to Norman's house right now and tell him what the others thought of him. But before that, he decided to catch Eric in something unflattering, so that everyone else would be convinced of the unfairness of Edgar's decision. He began to prepare his intrigues. Meanwhile, the teenagers, the youth of the village, had also learned the news. The young lady's eyes lit up, and the young men nodded approvingly. As the youths sat on a bench along the road, Eric was just about to go to another evening of entertainment. "Hey, Eric, you're awesome. Way to go," shouted one of them as he drove by. Eric didn't pay any attention to this remark, but just nodded his head in gratitude. A couple more days later, Eric was strolling down the main street of Istok. His path crossed with a local priest who was in a hurry to get to church. The priest remembered that this guy was a contender to be the best and decided to encourage him. "Eric, you're doing great. Your father must be proud of you. You're such a nice guy," he said as he walked by. Eric nodded his head, but in the back of his mind he wondered a little what had happened to his neighbors. Usually, they didn't even say hello. And here the compliments of admiration one after another. The cop who surprised him the most was the one who came running in from a distance and shook his hand. "Eric, I always believed in you. You're a good man. We need people like you in our society. You'll see, soon the young people will start to follow your example. See if their morals improved," said the cop. Eric was definitely in a reverie now. It was as if the neighbors and the villagers were in cahoots. But he was quite pleased with this attitude. All day long he walked in high spirits. And the next day, as he walked down the street, without noticing it, he began to greet everyone first. And old Betty even invited him into her house and treated him to pies, which she only drank. When Iris called her friend, she was reading a sad novel and periodically sighed heavily. The misunderstanding in her relationship with Norman had taken a great toll on her. Of course, he didn't bring up the breakup again, but a cold wall had formed between them. Her friend had decided to support her today. "Iris, but how are you still sad there, or everything is getting better?" asked her friend Catherine. "It seems to have gotten better, but it's not the same. I think Norman is harboring doubts in his soul. I do not know how to influence it, so I am sad." To be honest, I'm tormented between two men, she sighed. What's the matter with Eric? He still oppresses you, and you can't tell his father anything so as not to ruin their relationship, Catherine asked. Speaking of Eric, things are about to change. Remember, I told you that we have a new neighbor, a weirdo, a millionaire. He promised $1 million to whoever was chosen to be the best man in the village. I went to him and told him that Eric was the best man. Iris grinned. What do you mean he's the best man when he's a drunk and a bully? And anyway, what did he do to deserve such happiness as a free $1 million? Catherine wondered. It's very simple. If he's lucky, Eric will get this money, and the first thing he will do is to get away from his father. He will want to buy a house and live separately, and then he will want to organize his business separately from his father. The business is fine. He's not really into it anyway. He's agreeing to inherit it purely for the money, Iris said. Well, if that's the case, of course. Don't you have a chance of getting that $1 million yourself? Catherine asked. I don't think so. To get it, I'd have to have someone else give me that kind of feedback. And no one here knows me. The ones who do know me quietly hate me. I don't know why. But I could certainly do something else if I wanted to, Iris said. The conversation went on for a long time, but the subject of money was never mentioned again. The last few days had been very meaningful for Eric. Active attention and recognition at every turn. It had changed his outlook on life and people dramatically. In just a few days, he had noticed how many interesting and friendly people there were among these neighbors. He even began to feel shy deep down. That before he had always considered them petty people and disdained them. Now Eric could calmly linger on the street for a conversation with another neighbor. He could safely go to any of them in the house, sit at the same table. He liked that very much. Suddenly, Eric felt that he also wanted to do something nice for these people. The first such person was an old lady-to-be. Eric specially set aside a free day to fix the old lady's old furniture. True, he had never done such a thing before. But the old lady herself helped him with hints, and when the business was over, she treated him to her delicious pie again. At parting, the old woman patted the boy on the shoulder and blessed him with good luck. Eric experienced such pleasant feelings for the first time in his life. A couple of days later, he wanted to feel this state again. He started looking for someone to help him with some things. A priest came to mind. When Eric arrived at the church, he was tidying up the yard. Eric asked him to sit on a bench while he hauled all the leather hay to the back of the church. When the job was done, the priest blessed him for good luck too. Then he invited the boys into the cellar, where they drank simple herbal tea. The priest told Eric different parables that made the guy think even more. Freud. Meanwhile, every day he asked Mr. Edgar about the results of the experiment. He was looking for a way to foil Iris's plans to keep Eric from becoming the best man in Freddy's village. 1,000 times I regretted that I had written so many complaints about almost every one of my neighbors in the first phase. I should have left at least one alone. Now that one could have been listed as the best, if that one had won $1 million from the old man, it would be split in half. Brady was doubly angry at his stupidity, and when he found out that the second candidate never showed up, with only a few days to go before the end of the experiment, he got into everything. Constant drinking. And today she decided to try once again to return the former warm attitude of her husband. She cooked his favorite dish, put on her best dresses, organized a romantic setting, and called her husband. Darling, so much has happened between us lately. I'm asking you to try to come home early tonight. I want us to have a romantic dinner, she said. I can't promise you anything as I have important things planned for today. I'll probably be late. Dryly, Norman replied. The conversation ended very quickly. Norman hung up the phone and thought. Since his wife was trying to win back his favor, she must have something to be ashamed of. The detectives, of course, found nothing suspicious in Iris's lifestyle, but still she was only to blame for allowing a situation in which he had to question her fidelity. Norman thought his deception about important business for the evening was correct. But in fact, he had no important business to attend to. He had purposely decided not to have dinner together, so that Iris would be tormented as long as possible, and henceforth would not even think of breaking relations with him. Let this be a lesson to her for a long time, Norman thought. Meanwhile, the day of announcing the winners of Edgar's experiment was approaching. Everyone awaits this day with curiosity. Traditionally, on this day, Edgar would set a lavish table, serving the best wines and the most exquisite dishes. His neighbors didn't doubt it until they saw the sign on Edgar's gate and the sale of his house. Did our neighbor decide to move out? He didn't like it here. Where's he gonna move to? What's gonna happen to his experiment? Was it really a hoax? Were the neighbors whispering amongst themselves? Oh no, I've never cheated anyone in my life. It'll be just as I promised you, Mr. Edgar himself said. About that. Indeed, on the appointed day, everyone showed up except the Norman family. Eric was busy that day with his charity projects he had recently launched. Norman decided to intentionally stay late at work, and Iris waited faithfully for him. The guests feasted on gourmet food, drank good wine, and marveled at Eric for not coming to such an important event for him. In the middle of the evening, Mr. Edgar asked for the audience's attention. You all know the occasion for which we are gathered here. I don't want to keep you waiting. I've already sold this house to a good man. He'll be moving in any day now. And I'm leaving your pleasant company, for my experiment has achieved its purpose. I know who is the best man among you, said Mr. Edgar, and started walking around the table again. Eric, of course. Eric, this has long been known, but the lad is worthy. He's changed in a good way. Ever since the rumors started, the guests have been whispering about it. And that person is Mrs. Iris. It's a pity she didn't come. But I'll be sure to stop by before I leave and give her the money, Mr. Edgar said, and asked one of his bodyguards to show him the suitcase with the money. There was indeed real money in it, neatly stacked in a row. The guests were in such deep surprise, as they knew nothing about this woman. And this woman did not know that she had been chosen as the winner of this contest. 2 days later, early in the morning, Norman found a tiny note on the kitchen table from his wife, saying that she was leaving for Mr. Edgar and divorcing him.